The day they stripped a king of his name, nobody in that great marble hall looked him in the eyes. Not one soul. Because when power decides to erase you, it needs you to disappear quietly. And Kaelin Ashbourne had never learned how to be quiet. This is the story of what happens when an empire turns its back on the man who built it. Stay with me until the end, because nothing about this is what you expect. And if you're watching from somewhere tonight, drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my people are. Hit like if you're already angry. You should be. The hall smelled of candle wax and old stone and something else. Something Kaelin recognized from every battlefield he had ever walked after the killing was done. Fear, sweat. The particular kind that soaks through formal robes and expensive doublets and leaves rings beneath armpits regardless of how much silver a man carries on his person. He had been standing in the center of the imperial throne room for 11 minutes. He knew because he had counted. After 20 years commanding armies, Kaelin Ashbourne had learned that the first man to speak in a silence like this one was the man who had already lost. So he stood with his hands loose at his sides, the way he always stood when he was deciding whether someone in front of him deserved his patience or his contempt. And he let the Imperial Council sweat through their robes. Lord Chancellor Aldrich Sorn cleared his throat for the third time. Your Majesty. He used the title the way a man uses a door he is about to lock from the outside. The council has reached its determination. Kaelin said nothing. He was looking at the banners. 4 of them. His family's seal, the Iron Hawk with spread wings, hung from the eastern wall, flanked by the imperial colors he had carried into 14 wars. The silk was faded at the edges. Someone had let them go without proper care for years, and he was only noticing it now, standing at the center of the room where everything about this empire came into focus in ways it never did from the throne itself. The evidence presented by House Varden and corroborated by 6 city noble houses establishes with sufficient clarity. Say it plain, Kaelin said. His voice did not rise. It never rose. 20 years of command had cured him of the need to shout. Aldrich Sorn stopped. Across the semicircle of council chairs, 12 faces arranged themselves into expressions of careful neutrality. Kaelin had once been able to read every one of these men. Now he studied them the way he studied terrain before a campaign, not looking for what was visible, but for what had been deliberately hidden. Say what you came here to say, Aldrich. I have waited long enough. The Lord Chancellor set down his parchment. That small gesture, the deliberate placement of paper on mahogany, told Kaelin everything. Rehearsed. All of this had been rehearsed. The Imperial Council, acting in accordance with the emergency provisions established under the Third Compact, hereby moves to suspend your authority pending formal investigation into the conduct of— Suspend, Kaelin repeated. The word came out flat and quiet. You mean remove. The language of the provision specifies— I know what the provision specifies. I was present when it was written. Kaelin finally moved, walking 3 slow steps toward the council table. Nobody moved away from him, to their credit. What I'm asking you is to use honest language in this room for what I estimate is probably the first time in a decade. Silence again. The candles along the eastern wall guttered in a draft from somewhere. It was Lord Fenric Hale who finally spoke. He was the youngest member of the council, barely 40, elevated to his seat 18 months ago after his predecessor died of a fever that several physicians found suspiciously convenient. Fenric had bright eyes and the careful smile of a man who had calculated every room he ever walked into. The throne requires stability, Fenric said. The Western campaigns have strained imperial resources beyond what the treasury can sustain. 3 border kingdoms are threatening to withdraw from existing treaties. The council believes what it has been told to believe, Kaelin said. By whom is the question I find interesting. Fenric's smile did not change. By the evidence, Your Majesty. What evidence? This was the moment Aldrich Sorn had clearly prepared for. He reached beneath the table and withdrew a leather satchel, from which he produced a collection of bound documents and placed them in a careful stack with the precision of a man who has practiced this gesture. Financial records, Aldrich said. Correspondence between your personal seal and several lords in the eastern provinces. Evidence that military supply shipments were redirected during the Battle of the Amber Pass to prevent my own army from receiving supplies, Kaelin finished. The records are fabricated. The room absorbed this quietly. Kalen looked around the semicircle of faces again. 12 men. He had fought alongside 3 of them. He had saved the life of 1. He had personally championed the elevation of 2 others when their predecessors were found incompetent. And every single face in that room was giving him the same careful, polished expression of a man who had already decided what today would accomplish before walking through the door. "You have already made your decision," Kalen said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation delivered with the same tone he used when reading field reports. "This proceeding is theater." "It is the law," Aldrich said. "It is theater dressed in law." Kalen walked to the window. Below, the imperial capital spread outward in the gray morning light. Rooftops and market squares and the distant spire of the eastern garrison, where the soldiers he had trained and bled with were going about their morning drills, without knowing that their commander-in-chief was currently being removed from power inside a room full of men in expensive robes. Every man in this chamber knows the Western campaign failed because the supply lines were cut. What you are telling me is that the person who cut them is the same person who is now presenting the cutting as evidence of my guilt. Your Majesty, do not. His voice did not rise, but something in its texture changed, something that had nothing to do with volume. Every man in the room felt it. Do not call me that with the same mouth you are using to strip it from me. Lord Fenric leaned forward. Kalen. First name, deliberate. This does not have to be difficult. The suspension is temporary pending investigation. Regent Voss will assume administrative duties. The Empire will continue to function. At the conclusion of the investigation, if the evidence does not support, Regent Voss. Kalen turned from the window. You have already named a regent. The silence that followed was approximately 1 second long. 1 second during which 11 council members arranged their expressions with practiced care, and one, a gray-haired lord in the corner named Court Aldman, a man who had served under Kalen's father before serving under Kalen himself, looked briefly, involuntarily, at the floor. 1 second, and Kalen learned everything he needed to know. When was Voss named? He said. The council convened last evening to... When was Voss named? He said again, still quiet. Aldrich Sorn picked up his parchment. 3 days ago. 3 days ago. Before the evidence was presented, before the formal proceeding, before the theater had even begun its first act, Kalen stood in the center of the imperial throne room, the room where his father had placed the crown on his head 19 years ago, and felt something he had not felt in a very long time. Not anger, something older and colder and far more dangerous than anger. Clarity. He had seen this before. In other kingdoms, in other men. The moment power decides you are no longer useful is rarely the moment it tells you so. Power is patient. Power places its pieces carefully and names its regents quietly and builds its case from forged correspondence while you are sleeping. And by the time the room smells of fierce sweat and candle wax, the decision is 3 days old. I will not contest the suspension, Kalen said. Several council members exhaled. He watched them do it and filed away every face. I will, however, require time to arrange my departure from the palace. A week. 3 days, Aldrich said. 5. 3. Kalen looked at him for a long moment. 4. A pause. Then Aldrich nodded. 4 days, Kalen said. And I want it recorded in the official proceedings that I contest the legitimacy of this evidence and the process by which this determination was reached. Duly noted, Aldrich said, writing something on his parchment. Kalen looked at the notation. He was nearly certain Aldrich was writing nothing at all. He walked to the door. Behind him, he heard the immediate low murmur of council members beginning to speak among themselves, the particular tone of a room that believes its occupant has left before he actually has. He stopped with his hand on the iron latch. Court, he said. The gray-haired lord in the corner looked up from the floor. Your father died at the Battle of Greymere. I sent 4 men to carry him out because I would not leave him in a field for crows. Kalen held Court Aldman's gaze. Remember that. He left. The corridor outside the throne room was lined with palace servants and junior household staff, who had positioned themselves in the careful, sideways manner of people who desperately want to witness something without appearing to do so. Kalen walked past all of them without adjusting his pace. He had learned a long time ago that a man's stride communicates more than any words he might speak, and he would not give anyone in this building the satisfaction of watching him move like a man who had been defeated. He was not defeated. He was recalibrating. His personal chambers were on the third floor of the eastern residential wing, a suite of rooms he had occupied for 19 years and never particularly personalized. He had always treated them as a soldier treats a camp, somewhere to sleep and think, not somewhere to belong. He had never understood men who built elaborate nests for themselves in places of power. It made you slow when you needed to move. He was grateful for that now. His steward, an older man named Davin, who had served in this household since Kalen's father's era, was waiting outside the chamber doors with the expression of someone who had received bad news before his employer had. "You already know," Kalen said. "The morning staff talk," Davin said simply. He opened the chamber door. "I had the kitchen send up something substantial. You have not eaten since last evening." "I am not hungry. You should eat anyway." Davin followed him inside. "What do you need me to do?" Kalen stood in the center of his sitting room and looked at the maps on the wall. He kept them not for decoration, but because he thought better when he could see terrain. Every border of the empire was marked in his own hand. Supply routes, garrison positions, the names of commanders he trusted, and the names of commanders he was watching. He needed to think about what he actually knew versus what he believed. What he knew, the council had removed him. The evidence was fabricated. Regent Voss had been named 3 days before the proceeding. Fenric Hale had led the questioning. Aldrich Sorn had coordinated the presentation. Court Aldman had looked at the floor. What he believed, this was not an opportunistic seizure. This had been planned over months, possibly longer. The Western campaign's supply failures had not been incompetence. They had been engineering. Someone had built the conditions under which removing him would appear not only legal, but necessary. Someone with access to imperial financial records. Someone with the patience to forge correspondence and the connections to get 12 council lords to unanimous agreement. Someone who understood exactly how far Kalen's reputation for ruthlessness would work against him when evidence of supply line sabotage was laid on a table. He needed names. "Davin," he said, "how many of the household staff do you trust completely?" Davin did not answer immediately. He was not a man given to careless answers. 6, perhaps 7. Good. Kalen moved to his desk and sat, pulling a fresh sheet of paper toward him. "I want every document that has passed through this chamber in the last 4 months, boxed and ready for transport. Personal correspondence, financial records, campaign orders, everything. To where? I do not know yet." He started writing. "Do not use palace couriers for anything related to this. Use street runners. Pay them in coin directly. Do you understand?" "Yes. And I need you to find someone for me." He paused with the quill above the paper. "There is a woman who works in the lower archives, librarian or records keeper of some kind. She came to my attention several months ago. She filed a discrepancy report on a border garrison payroll that turned out to be accurate when my own treasury officials had missed it. Do you know who I mean?" Davin thought for a moment. "Elira Vance." The name landed in his room with a quietness that had nothing to do with volume. Kalen repeated it in his mind once, testing its shape against the vague memory of a personnel report he had read and set aside and not forgotten. "Elira Vance," he said. "Yes, find her. Do not tell anyone why. Tell her only that she is needed for a records consultation regarding the Western Campaign archives. She works in the sub-archives. She is not likely to be on any council's list of significant people." "No," Kalen said. "She is not." He returned to writing, and Davin left quietly, the way he always did, moving through this household like water around stone. Kalen wrote for 40 minutes without stopping. He wrote everything he remembered about the past 6 months. Every meeting, every unusual request, every conversation that had felt slightly misaligned with context at the time. He had always trusted his instincts in the field. He had trusted them less in politics because politics had too many layers of motive, and he had never been interested enough in those layers to learn them properly. That was the error. A king who relies on military instinct to navigate political conspiracy is a king who brings a sword to a poisoning. The weapon is real, the skill is genuine, and none of it matters once the cup has already been passed. He set down the quill when the door opened. Not Davin. Davin knocked twice before entering. This was a single knock. and then the sound of the latch immediately following, which meant either someone with urgency or someone with authority who did not feel they needed to wait. Captain Ren Alcott entered. He was Kalen's senior guard commander, a lean man in his mid-40s with a crooked nose from a bar fight 15 years ago, and the kind of stillness that comes from having spent decades in rooms where violence is always approximately 3 seconds away. He closed the door behind him and stood in the particular posture that Kalen recognized as carrying bad news that could not be delayed. "Ren, there are 4 council guards posted at the main stairway," Ren said. "2 more at the east corridor entrance. My men were relieved of the residential wing posts an hour ago." Kalen absorbed this. Already. Ren's jaw was tight. "They replaced my people with Voss's private household guard. Men I do not know and cannot account for." This was faster than Kalen had expected. The council had agreed to 4 days. Posting Voss's household guard the same morning was either impatience or a message. He considered which one was more dangerous. "Your loyalty right now," Kalen said carefully. "I am asking plainly. The council has legal authority over this household as of this morning. What you do next puts you on one side or the other of a line that is going to become very significant." Ren looked at him. "I have served under you for 11 years. You pulled me out of a court-martial for striking a lord who deserved it and gave me my command back." "That is not an answer." "It is the only one you need." Ren pulled a sealed letter from his coat and placed it on the desk. "This came through the street courier network this morning, not palace channels. It was addressed to your steward's brother's bakehouse and then brought here by hand." Kalen looked at the seal. He did not recognize it. A plain impression in dark wax, no signet, no house markings, just a small mark that looked like 2 lines intersecting at an angle. He broke it and read. The letter contained 4 sentences. The 4th sentence made him sit very still for approximately 10 seconds. He folded the letter and looked up at Ren. "How many of my guard are still inside the building?" 8 who would follow orders from me rather than the council. "I need them to appear completely cooperative with the transition," Kalen said. "Fully cooperative. No friction, no protest. If Voss's men want access to any part of this wing, granted immediately." Ren's expression indicated this was not the order he had expected. "Sir, I need to appear fully accepting of this process while I still have 4 days of legitimate residence in this building." Kalen stood. "What the council does not understand is that the building is not the resource I need to protect." Ren waited. "The information is..." Kalen picked up the folded letter. "Go. Be visible. Be cooperative. Tell anyone who asks that your commander is settling his affairs quietly and without incident." After Ren left, Kalen stood at the window again and read the letter a second time. 4 sentences. The first identified the sender as someone with access to imperial treasury records. The second claimed that the evidence used in this morning's proceeding had originated from a private correspondence between Lord Fenric Hale and someone referred to only as the architect. The third stated that there was a second set of documents, genuine ones, that had been deliberately removed from the Western Campaign archives 3 weeks before the proceeding. The 4th sentence read, "The woman who removed them did not work for the council. She works in the sub-archives. Her name is Elira Vance." He found her himself. He had not intended to. Davin had been sent to bring her, and Kalen had planned to remain in his chambers and let the summons work through proper channels. But 40 minutes after sending Davin, he found himself in the lower corridors of the East Wing, moving through the part of the palace that most people with authority never visited because there was nothing there that people with authority generally wanted. The sub-archives occupied 3 connected rooms beneath the library level. They smelled of dust and aging paper, and the particular damp that comes from stone walls that have never seen direct sunlight. The ceilings were low, the shelving was crowded. Every surface was covered with documents organized in a system that was not immediately legible to anyone who had not spent years building it. She was at a table near the far wall, working under a lamp that was better than the general lighting in the room, which suggested she had arranged her own working conditions without asking anyone's permission. She was perhaps 26 or 27, plain in the way that people who spend no time on appearance are plain, not unattractive, simply unconcerned. Dark hair pulled back with a cord that had seen better days. ink on the outside of her left hand and on 2 fingers of her right. She was reading 2 documents simultaneously, holding one in each hand, moving her eyes between them with the focused intensity of someone comparing language structures. She did not look up when he entered. "I will be with you momentarily," she said, still reading. "If you are looking for pre-campaign records for the eastern provinces, they are in the section behind you marked with a red ribbon. If you are looking for Treasury correspondence from the last fiscal year, that entire section is currently being reorganized and is not accessible." "Neither," Kaylin said. She looked up. He watched her process his face. The exact moment recognition arrived was visible in her eyes before she controlled it. A brief, involuntary widening, and then a very fast recalibration into something careful. She stood. "Your Majesty." She did not bow the way courtiers bowed with elaborate formality. She did it the way soldiers do, economically. "I was not informed—" "Sit down," he said. "Please." She sat. He remained standing because the room did not offer much room for pacing, and he was not going to sit across from her as though this were a comfortable conversation. He pulled the folded letter from his coat and set it on the table. She looked at it. Her expression did not change. Her hands, resting on the table, were very still. He noted the stillness. People who knew nothing were generally surprised by surprising things. People who knew something tended toward stillness. "I received this morning," he said. "Anonymous. Street courier. It mentions your name." She said nothing. "I would like to hear your version of events before I decide what the letter means," he said. She was quiet for another moment, and he let her have it. He had learned a long time ago that the quality of information you receive is directly related to how much silence you are willing to hold before it arrives. "3 weeks ago," she said, "I was conducting a routine inventory of the Western Campaign secondary files. These are the operational support documents, supply requisitions, route authorizations, correspondence between garrison commanders, and the logistics office. They are not considered primary records, so they do not receive regular oversight." "What did you find?" "Inconsistencies," she said. "Specifically, a set of requisitions that had been filed under campaign authorization and then marked as unfulfilled, meaning the supplies were ordered, but the order was canceled, which would be unusual on its own, but not remarkable. Cancellations happen. But the cancellations were dated 4 days before the Battle of the Amber Pass, and the authorization codes attached to the cancellations did not match any officer listed in the chain of command for that operation." She reached beneath the table without looking away from him and withdrew a folder. "I began pulling the connected documents, which is within the standard scope of my responsibilities. Routine cross-referencing is part of archive maintenance." She placed the folder on the table next to the letter. He did not touch it yet. "The cancellations were signed," she continued, "with a code that does not belong to any person on current or historical record as having campaign logistics authority. I have been in this archive for 4 years. I know every authorization code in the Western Campaign filing system." "Whose code was it?" She paused for exactly the length of time a person pauses when they are deciding whether to say something that will significantly change their circumstances. "It is not a person's code," she said. "It is a ledger code. It belongs to a private account. The account number is registered to a holding company that does not appear in any public imperial record, but appears 3 times in correspondence I found attached to the canceled requisitions." "Which correspondence?" "Letters," she said, "between someone who signed only with initials, F.H., and someone referred to in the letters as the architect, F.H. Fenric Hale." Kaelin kept his face still. He was very practiced at this. "Where are these documents now?" he said. "I removed them from the archive 3 weeks ago," she said, "after I found them. I did not file a report because I was not certain what I was looking at, and because the standard protocol for significant discrepancies is to report to the senior archivist, whose name I will not say in this room." "Why not?" "Because his wife is Lord Hale's cousin," she said simply. "And I have been in this building long enough to understand how information travels when it travels in the wrong direction." She had removed the documents. She had not reported them. She had held them for 3 weeks while the council built its case from forgeries, while 12 men in a semicircle of chairs prepared their theater, while someone named the regent and stamped the paperwork and arranged the guards. And she had done it in complete isolation, in a room beneath the library where no one with authority ever came, and she had not told a single person because she had looked at the information available to her and made the correct calculation about who could be trusted. "You have them," Kaylin said. "I have copies," she said. "The originals have been placed somewhere outside this building." She met his eyes directly. I did not know what they meant or what I was going to do with them. I only knew they should not be accessible to whoever was looking for them. The lamp between them burned quietly. Somewhere above them, the palace was full of council guards and political transitions, and men in expensive robes conducting the business of removing a king. Down here there was dust and old paper, and a woman with ink on her hands who had quietly made a decision that would determine the shape of everything that happened next. "You understand what you have done," Kaylin said. "I understand what I found," she said. "I am less certain about the rest." If those documents establish what you believe they establish, you are a material witness to a conspiracy against the crown. Every person involved in that conspiracy now has significant motivation to ensure those documents never enter evidence. He watched her face. "You are not safe in this building." She did not look frightened. She looked, and he was reading her carefully because he needed to understand her, such as though she had already done this calculation and arrived at an answer she had not entirely figured out how to live with. "I know," she said. "Then why are you still here?" A pause. "Because I did not know where else to go," she said. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to him in a very long time, and it landed in his chest with a weight that surprised him. He picked up her folder. Inside were copies of documents she had made herself, in a hand that was careful and precise. The requisitions, the cancellation authorizations, the correspondence. He read through them in silence, standing at the table with the lamp between them, while she sat and waited and did not try to explain or interpret what he was reading. He needed 8 minutes. When he finished, he set the folder down. "The architect," he said. "In the correspondence, is there any indication of identity beyond the title?" "One letter," she said. "The third one. It mentions that the architect does not attend council sessions but is present for every vote." She hesitated. "I have a theory about what that means." "Tell me." "Someone who advises without holding a seat. A private counselor or a financial advisor. Someone who exercises council influence without being technically a council member and therefore without appearing on any formal accountability record." This was precise thinking, not the thinking of someone who processed documents by rote. She had taken incomplete information and drawn inferences that required understanding of how political structures actually functioned, which was knowledge that did not come from an archive. "Where did you work before this?" he said. She blinked. The question had shifted the register of the conversation, and she recalibrated. "The Eastern Province offices. Records management for the garrison payroll system. That is where you found the discrepancy that ended up in a report I read approximately 8 months ago." Something moved through her expression. "You read that report?" "I read everything flagged as a discrepancy by archive staff. Most of them are arithmetic errors." He looked at her. That one was not. She had flagged a garrison payroll discrepancy that his own treasury officials had missed, a set of payments to non-existent soldiers that had been funneling coin out of the imperial military budget for 3 years. He had assigned an investigation. The investigation had led to the removal of a garrison quartermaster and the recovery of significant funds. He had not thought again about who had found it. He was thinking about it now. "You notice things," he said. "I read things," she said. "Most people do not read carefully enough. Documents are written by people, and people reveal themselves in the language they use, the word choices, the inconsistencies, what they reference and what they avoid referencing." He stood in the low-ceilinged archive room and looked at a woman who had spent years in the most invisible position in the most powerful building in the empire. Reading documents nobody else was reading carefully, noticing what nobody else was noticing, and quietly removing evidence of a conspiracy against the crown because she had understood instinctively that the chain of command was compromised, and she could not trust the standard report process. She had not done it for him. She had done it because the documents told her that something was wrong, and her instinct was to correct things that were wrong. That was either the most valuable quality a person could have in this specific situation, or it was a performance designed by someone who had anticipated exactly this moment. He needed to decide which. "I'm going to ask you a direct question," he said, "and I want you to answer it the same way. She waited. Are you working for anyone who has an interest in my current situation? She held his gaze without blinking. No. Has anyone approached you about these documents, offered you anything for them, threatened you in any way? No, no, and no. A beat. Though I have been increasingly concerned about the third possibility since I found them. He believed her. He could not have said precisely why, except that deception in people who are genuinely frightened tends to produce a particular kind of energy, a brightness, an over-precision. And she had neither. She had the flatness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for 3 weeks without anyone to help hold it. All right, he said. He picked up the folder and the letter and tucked them both inside his coat. I cannot tell you what happens next because I do not know yet, he said. What I can tell you is that you should not sleep in your regular quarters tonight. Is there anywhere outside the palace you can go for the next several days? I have a room in the Eastern Market District, she said. I kept it when I moved into palace housing because… She stopped. I do not know why I kept it. It seemed sensible. He looked at her for a moment. The instinct to keep an exit had nothing to do with conscious strategy in her case. She had simply sensed at some level that a person in a building like this one should not put everything inside it. Go there tonight, he said. Tell no one. Take nothing that cannot be carried in one bag. And after that, send a message to this address. He wrote quickly on a scrap of paper from her desk and gave it to her. Use a street runner, not palace courier. Say nothing in the message except that you arrived safely. She took the paper, looked at the address, which meant nothing to her yet, and then folded it and placed it inside the binding of the book she had been using as a work surface beneath the inner cover. Quick, practiced, invisible. He was nearly at the door when she spoke. Your Majesty. He stopped. The third letter in the folder, she said. The one where the architect is mentioned. There is a date on that letter. He waited. It is dated 7 months ago, she said. 3 months before the Western campaign began. Kaelin stood very still in the doorway of the archive. 7 months ago. The Western campaign that had failed, the supply lines that had been cut, the battle that had cost him the Council's confidence and provided the justification for this morning's proceeding. All of it had been prepared for, designed for, built to produce exactly this outcome over 7 months, with the patience of someone who understood that removing a king through force risked a martyr, but removing him through process produced a precedent. I know, he said, but now he knew something else too. Something the letter had not told him, and Elira Vance had not thought to mention because she did not yet understand its significance. If the conspiracy had begun 7 months ago, then the meeting that had produced the letter had taken place inside this building during a period when only one external advisor had unrestricted access to Imperial Council sessions. One man who attended every vote without holding a council seat. One man who had resigned from formal advisory capacity the previous year in a departure that had seemed like retirement. His name came to Kaelin with the certainty of a man who has just placed the last piece of a long and difficult puzzle. And with that certainty came a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, because the man in question was not simply a former advisor. He was Kaelin's uncle, and he was the man who had placed the crown on Kaelin's head 19 years ago. Kaelin left the archive and walked 3 steps into the corridor and stopped. He put his back against the stone wall and breathed. In through the nose, slow, out through the mouth. He had been trained to do this after significant field intelligence. Not to process emotion. He had been told often enough by men who admired him that he did not process emotion the way other men did, and they had meant it as a compliment, and he had accepted it as one, though he was less certain now whether it was accurate or simply what someone looks like from the outside when they have learned to be very quiet about certain things. What he was doing was simpler. He was holding the information still inside himself, the way you hold a flame in a wind, until he could look at it clearly. 7 months. His uncle, Lord Marin Ashbourne, had served as the Empire's chief strategic counselor for 12 years before formally stepping back from the role 14 months ago. He had cited age, though he was 63 and had the energy of a man 20 years younger. He had remained in the capital. He had remained in the palace. He had remained at dinners and in corridors and in the edges of meetings where his presence was so habitual that nobody registered it as presence anymore. He was the architect. Kaelin knew it the way he had known the terrain of every battlefield he had ever won, not through calculation, but through the accumulation of small things that only become visible when you stop looking at the large thing in front of you. Marin had opposed the Western campaign from the beginning, quietly, without public statement. The way Marin did everything, through private conversation and the careful arrangement of alternatives. He had said the campaign was overextension. He had said the timing was poor. He had said there were better ways to secure the western border. Kaelin had not listened. And then the supply lines had been cut, and the battle had failed, and the council had spent 3 months building the case for this morning, and now Kaelin was standing in a corridor with his back against old stone and his uncle's name burning inside his chest like a coal. The question was not why. That was the question a young man asked. A younger version of himself would have spent the next hour trying to understand motive, trying to find the betrayal that explained a betrayal. The question was what? What does a man do when the person who built him has decided to unmake him? What does a man do when the architecture of his removal was laid in by hands he once trusted more than any other hands in the world? He heard footsteps coming down the corridor from the east. Heavy, deliberate, more than one person. He pushed off the wall and was walking before the thought was complete, moving away from the footsteps with the unhurried pace of a man who has somewhere to be and no particular concern about who is behind him, which was entirely accurate because he was not going to run from Voss's household guard in his own palace on the first day of a 4-day period during which he was technically still in residence. He had 4 days. He had a folder of copied documents. He had a street courier address written on a scrap of paper in the hands of a woman in the sub-archives who noticed things. And somewhere in this building, a man who was 63 years old and had spent 12 years learning exactly how empires were kept and exactly how they were broken was waiting to see whether his nephew was going to leave quietly. The footsteps behind him were closer now. Kaelin turned the corner and stopped. Standing at the end of the corridor in front of the main stairway that led up to the residential wing was a man he had not seen in 6 weeks. Silver-haired, upright. The kind of face that gave nothing away because it had spent decades learning not to. The same face that had once sat across from a 12-year-old boy and taught him that a king's greatest weapon was the capacity to appear entirely calm while making the most consequential decisions of his life. Marin Ashbourne looked at his nephew from 30 feet away and smiled. "Kaelin," he said. The warmth in his voice was genuine. That was the most terrible thing about it. "I had hoped to speak with you before the end of the day." Kaelin stood very still. "Walk with me," Marin said, moving toward him with the unhurried ease of a man who had not yet realized that the game had changed. "There are things I would like to explain." Behind Kaelin, the footsteps rounded the corner and stopped. He did not need to turn around to know that Voss's guards were now positioned at both ends of the corridor. He looked at his uncle. Marin was still smiling, and Kaelin understood, with the cold certainty of a man reading terrain, that this conversation was not an offer to explain. It was an attempt to determine exactly what he knew. Kaelin did not move. That was the first thing. The guards at both ends of the corridor, the silver-haired man with the warm smile, the geometry of the space that had been arranged, all of it was designed to produce a particular response, and that response was movement. Step back, step forward. Do something that reveals the internal calculation. He had been in ambushes before, real ones, with iron and blood and men screaming in the dark. He had learned early that the first instinct in an ambush is almost always wrong because it is generated by fear, and fear is not stupid, but it is fast, and fast and right are not the same thing. He stood still. "Walk with me," Marin said again, the same warmth, the same patient tone of a man accustomed to people eventually doing what he suggested. "I am comfortable here," Kaelin said. Something shifted almost imperceptibly in Marin's expression, a slight adjustment around the eyes. The smile remained, but its architecture changed, became less automatic, more deliberate. This was information. "You look tired," Marin said, and began walking toward him anyway, not quickly, the unhurried approach of a man who has decided the conversation is happening regardless of where it happens. "This morning was difficult. I understand that. I would like to—" "Stop there." Marin stopped. 4 feet between them now, close enough that Kaelin could see the particular quality of his uncle's stillness, which was the stillness of a man who was also reading terrain. "You came to determine what I know," Kaelin said. "I understand that. I would prefer not to conduct that conversation with guards at both ends of the corridor, so let us agree to be direct with each other and use the time more efficiently. A pause. Then Marin exhaled through his nose, a short sound, nearly a laugh, and said, "You always move faster than I expected. You taught me that?" "I taught you many things." Marin's voice had changed. Not cold, still warm, but underneath the warmth was something that had been waiting behind it for a long time. Something patient and old and completely certain of itself. Most of them were true. "Most," Kaelin said. "Most," Marin agreed. They looked at each other in the low stone corridor with the candle sconces throwing uneven light and the guards at both ends pretending to be furniture. What Kaelin was feeling in that moment was not what most men would have expected him to feel. There was no volcanic surge of rage, no grief breaking the surface. What he felt was the particular sensation of a weight he had been carrying without knowing he was carrying it, the accumulated pressure of 19 years of trust in one direction, becoming suddenly visible to him as a weight, which is the precise moment when a burden becomes a decision about whether to continue holding it. He decided to put it down. Not because he had finished with his uncle, because he needed both hands free. "How long?" Kaelin said. Marin tilted his head slightly, not denying. 3 years of intention, 1 year of active planning. 3 years. 1 year. The Western campaign had been Kaelin's idea, his own idea, built on intelligence he had gathered himself, pushed through a council that had initially resisted it. He had believed the resistance was about resources and risk calculation. "The campaign," Kaelin said. "You needed me to fail at something significant. I needed the Empire to have a reason," Marin said. "Reasons matter. A king removed without cause produces instability for decades. A king removed for cause, even constructed cause, produces a transition." He moved to lean against the wall with a casualness that Kaelin recognized as one of his uncle's most deliberate affectations, the performance of ease in tension. "You are not a bad king, Kaelin. I want you to understand that. This was never about your competence." "Then what was it about?" "It was about the Empire needing something you have not been able to give it." A pause. "Flexibility." Kaelin let the words sit in the corridor between them. "You're a war king," Marin continued, and there was genuine conviction in his voice, which was the most unsettling quality of this conversation, the fact that his uncle believed this. "You are the finest military commander this empire has produced in 3 generations. Your campaigns have expanded the borders, secured the eastern supply routes, held the northern passes that every previous king lost. These are not small things. I have never pretended they were small. But the empire that exists now is not the empire those victories built it to be. The border kingdoms do not need to be held by force anymore. They need to be held by relationship, by trade and treaty, and the patient building of mutual benefit. And you," Marin paused, "you see negotiation as a slower form of warfare, which works until it stops working, and when it stops working, you reach for the instrument you know. So you decided to remove me. I decided the Empire needed a different instrument, and you decided to use forgery and fabricated evidence and the coordinated manipulation of 12 council members to implement that decision. I decided to use what was available." Marin's voice had the flat practicality of a man who does not experience his own choices as moral failures because he has long since reclassified them as strategic necessities. The council was persuadable. The evidence, while constructed, pointed toward patterns that were real, even if the specific documents were not. The Western campaign did fail. Supply problems did occur. I simply organized the interpretation. "You organized the destruction of my reputation." "I organized a transition," Marin said. "There is a difference." There it was. Kaelin had understood this intellectually from the moment Elira's folder confirmed what he suspected, but hearing Marin say it aloud, with that tone, that genuine conviction that he was describing a reasonable administrative decision rather than a deliberate dismantling, produced something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived in the territory between them. A man who does a monstrous thing and knows it is monstrous is comprehensible. You can argue with him, threaten him, appeal to the part of him that knows what he has done. A man who does the same thing and has organized his thinking so thoroughly that he experiences it as competent management is a different problem entirely. Regent Voss, Kalen said. Whose choice? Voss, Kalen said. Whose? The council's formally. Mine in practice. Marin said it without hesitation. Voss is manageable. He understands the relationship between formal authority and actual influence. He will not make your mistake. My mistake. Of believing that holding the crown meant you made the decisions. The silence that followed this was the kind that has specific weight. Kalen looked at his uncle. The silver hair, the upright posture, the face that had been the most constant fixture of his formation, the voice that had walked him through every strategic crisis of his reign, the mind he had trusted more than any other, the man who had placed the crown on his head in this very building 19 years ago. You have been making the decisions, Kalen said slowly. For how long? Marin's expression did not change. Long enough. That is not an answer. It is the only honest one. A beat. I advised strongly. You made the final calls, some of which I agreed with, some of which I opposed, all of which I managed the consequences of. That is what I am. That is what I have always been. The crown was yours. What it governed has always been a more complex negotiation. The architecture of 19 years rearranged itself inside Kalen's understanding. Not all of it. He would not give Marin that satisfaction, the satisfaction of believing his nephew had been a passive instrument throughout a 2-decade reign. The campaigns were his. The military structures were his. The border expansions had been built on decisions Marin had actively opposed. But some of it, more than some, the domestic policy arrangements he had delegated, the council appointments he had accepted on recommendation, the trade agreements whose details he had never fully read because Marin had summarized them and he had trusted the summary. A king who delegates his own reign to someone he trusts completely is not a king making decisions. He is a king providing legitimacy for someone else's decisions. He had been a flag, not a fool. He had done real things, fought real battles, made real choices that mattered. But a flag. Something to carry that gave the decisions underneath it the appearance of authority. You have one option, Marin said, and his voice had settled into the tone Kalen remembered from childhood. The patient, instructive tone of a man explaining something to someone who needed to understand it. Leave with the 4 days you negotiated. Take whatever you can reasonably carry. I can arrange a comfortable establishment in the northern estates. You still have personal holdings there. It is not a bad life, Kalen. It is a quiet one. And if I choose not to accept that option, a pause. Not long. Marin was not a man who needed long pauses. Then the process becomes less comfortable. His voice was still warm. That was the terrible thing. It was still warm. I do not want that. I am being direct with you because I respect you and because I hoped this conversation would make the next several days simpler for both of us. You hoped I would not know what you had done. I hoped knowing it would help you make the sensible choice. Kalen looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. I appreciate your directness, he said. Give me until morning to consider your offer. Something in Marin's posture relaxed slightly. Almost nothing. But Kalen had spent his entire life reading this man's body. Of course, Marin said. Morning. Kalen walked past him toward the stairway. The guard at the eastern end stepped aside without incident. He climbed the stairs without looking back. He did not need to look back to know that Marin was watching him go with the expression of a man who believes he has successfully negotiated the end of a problem. What his uncle did not know, what Kalen had spent the length of that corridor conversation making certain he would not know, was that morning was approximately 16 hours away, and Kalen had been trained to do a great deal in less time than that. He needed Ren, not through channels, not through the normal communication paths that now ran through Voss's household guard and could be intercepted at 6 different points between the 3rd floor and the East Barracks. He needed Ren the way you need a man in the field when the formal chain has been compromised, directly, in person, with a message that left no record. He also needed to appear to be doing exactly nothing. Kalen returned to his chambers, dismissed the 2 palace attendants who were technically there to assist him and practically there to report his movements, told them he intended to rest before the evening meal, and sat in his chair by the window with a book open on his knee. He read the same page for 40 minutes, not reading it, listening, learning the rhythms of the corridor outside his door, the guard rotation, the specific sound of each pair of boots, the gap between rounds. Every building had a heartbeat if you were still enough to feel it, and a palace was simply a building that had convinced itself it was more. At the 50-minute mark, the corridor went quiet for approximately 3 minutes, which was longer than the normal rotation gap. This either meant a schedule change or a brief discussion happening at the far end of the hall. And brief discussions among guards who did not know each other well happened when one of them had gone to relieve himself and the other was waiting rather than walking the route. 3 minutes. Kaelin was at the window. The eastern residential wing had a series of decorative ledges below the upper floor windows, architectural remnants from a previous century when the building had been smaller. He had known about them for 19 years in the way you know about things you never expect to use. He used them now. 4 minutes later, on the interior courtyard level, he moved along the shadow line of the colonnade toward the East Barracks entrance. He was wearing a plain wool overcoat from the back of his wardrobe, the kind of garment a minor palace official might wear, unremarkable in color and cut. A king learns very quickly that visibility is a choice. People see what they expect to see, and what they expect to see in a corridor or a courtyard is whatever belongs there. The question is simply whether you have arranged yourself to belong. He found Ren in the barracks armory, running what appeared to be a very deliberate and methodical inventory of equipment that Kaelin was nearly certain did not actually need inventorying. Ren looked up when he entered. One beat of complete stillness, and then he returned his attention to the inventory. The Eastern Watch changed over early, Ren said in the tone of a man making conversation. New schedule. Third floor residential now runs on the half hour instead of the hour. I noticed, Kaelin said, moving to stand beside him at the equipment wall. I have about 6 minutes. 5, Ren corrected quietly. The barracks runner comes through at the bottom of the next quarter. I spoke with Marin. A pause in the inventory. How bad? He designed the entire thing. 3 years of intention, his words. He has offered me a quiet retirement in the northern estates. Ren set down the piece of equipment he was holding. He did not say anything, but something in the set of his shoulders communicated that he had an opinion about the northern estates offer that was not suitable for formal report. I need 3 things, Kaelin said. First, the woman from the sub-archives, Elira Vance. I told her to go to her private rooms in the Eastern Market District tonight. I need someone outside palace channels to confirm she arrived safely and is not followed. Who do you trust outside this building? Ren thought for approximately 4 seconds. My sister's husband runs a supply warehouse near the Eastern Gate. He has nothing to do with palace politics, and he owes me a substantial personal favor. Can he follow someone without being obvious about it? He can watch someone arrive somewhere without being in the street when they get there. Which is better? Yes, Kaelin agreed. That is better. Do it. He watches the approach to her rooms, notes whether anyone is in the street before or after she arrives, and sends word to you by morning. Done. Second, Captain Aldrich in the Southern Garrison. Not the man on the council, his brother. He commands the 3rd Cavalry Unit stationed at the Greymere Outpost. Kaelin kept his voice even. Aldrich and I have a private signal. 3 specific questions in a specific order, written in a letter with my personal seal. It means, confirm loyalty, stand ready, await instruction. I need that letter out of the city before midnight. Ren was quiet for a moment. That is a significant step. I know. If that letter is intercepted, I know. Kaelin met his eyes. Do it anyway. Another beat. Then Ren nodded. Third, the council chamber records, specifically the official proceedings of this morning's session. Aldrich Sorn noted my formal objection to the proceeding and the evidence. I need a copy of that notation, specifically confirming that my objection was recorded. Why? Because if it was recorded, it is part of the official imperial legal record, and the imperial legal record cannot be altered without the signature of the Lord Chancellor and 2 senior judges. Kaelin paused. If my objection is in that record, I have standing. Legal standing in the form of a formal contestation that must be addressed before the suspension can be formalized. Ren looked at him steadily. And if Sorn did not actually record it, Then I know something specific about how they intend to conduct this, and that knowledge is also useful. Wren closed the inventory ledger. The chamber records are in the administrative wing. I have one man there I would trust with this. Send him tonight. I need it confirmed before dawn. Understood. A pause. What are you planning? I am planning to be the reasonable, cooperative former king your council guard escort saw walking calmly back to his chambers this evening. Kaelin moved toward the armory door. What I'm actually going to do is a separate matter. Wren almost smiled. You always said the battle was decided before the armies moved. I said my father taught me that. Kaelin paused at the door. It turns out my uncle taught me most things, which means I know exactly how he thinks. He left through the same shadow line he had used coming in, returned to the east ledge, and was back in his chair by the window with the book open on his knee when the guard rotation came through on the new half-hour schedule. The book was upside down. He straightened it and turned to a different page and read with complete concentration until the candles burned lower and the palace settled into its evening rhythm, and his thoughts moved through everything he knew with the cold, systematic clarity that he had learned to trust more than any emotion he had ever felt. The evening meal came on a tray, delivered by a kitchen attendant who was new to this floor and kept glancing at the door in the way of someone who had been told to report on what he observed. Kaelin ate everything on the tray because he was genuinely hungry, and because a man who refuses food when food is available is a man who does not know when he will eat again, and that kind of uncertainty he preferred to plan for rather than produce unnecessarily. After the attendant left, he wrote 3 letters. The first was to Regent Voss, formal and brief, acknowledging the transition and requesting a final ceremonial meeting in 2 days to facilitate a graceful handover. Cooperative, even-tempered. The letter of a man who understood that his situation had changed and was adapting with dignity. The second was to his uncle, also brief, accepting the offer of the northern estate in principle, requesting clarification on several administrative matters related to the transfer of personal holdings. Both letters were designed to communicate one thing: I am going quietly. The third letter he did not write on palace stationery. He wrote it on a piece of plain paper he had carried for years in a specific interior pocket of his field coat, the kind of paper that could have come from anywhere. He wrote it in the shorthand cipher he and his southern garrison captain had developed over 15 years of field correspondence, which had never been formally documented anywhere because it had evolved organically through use rather than design. He sealed the third letter with a plain wax impression, no signet. When Davin came to collect the dinner tray, Kaelin handed him all 3 letters without comment. Davin looked at them, understood by their arrangement which was which, and left. Kaelin stood at the window. Outside, the capital city moved through its evening business under a sky that had cleared after the gray morning, stars visible now in the gaps between the buildings. He could see the market district from here. Not specifically, but the glow of it, the particular light density of a part of the city that stayed active after dark. Somewhere in that glow, Elira Vance was either moving toward her private rooms or had already arrived there, and Wren's brother-in-law was either watching the approach or had received the message late and was still on his way. He did not know. That was the hardest part. Not the danger, not the complexity, not even the fact that his uncle had spent 3 years quietly engineering his removal. The hardest part was the fundamental uncertainty that he had spent his entire career as a military commander trying to reduce and could not reduce now because too many of the variables were people, and people were not terrain. He was not, he decided, a man made for waiting, which was unfortunate, given that the next several hours required exactly that. Elira did not go to her private rooms first. This was a decision she made while still in the archive, approximately 4 minutes after Kaelin Ashbourne left through the sub-archive door and his footsteps faded up the corridor. She sat at her work table in the low light of the lamp she had hung herself because the general lighting had always been inadequate, and she thought very carefully about what had just happened and what was likely to happen next. What had just happened? The king, the former king, technically, as of this morning, had come to her specifically. He had known her name. He had read a report she had filed 8 months ago. He had held the copied documents she had spent 3 weeks trying to decide what to do with, and he had read them in 8 minutes, which told her something about how fast his mind moved when it had something real to work with, rather than the managed information that people in his position were generally given. He had told her she was not safe. She believed him. The question was the order of operations. He had told her to go to the private rooms. What he had not considered, or had not known to consider, was that the corridor between the subarchives and the east exit of the palace passed through the administrative wing, and the administrative wing at this hour would have exactly 2 maintenance workers, 1 junior records official, and an indeterminate number of council guard who now had reason to be interested in her specific movements. She knew this building's rhythms the way she knew document organization systems, not through formal training, but through years of sustained attention to the patterns other people did not bother to notice because they were too significant to need to. The east exit was watched. The south exit required passing through the main hall, which was worse. The north service entrance, which was technically reserved for food deliveries and had a guard post that was staffed irregularly because it was considered low priority, was accessible through the kitchen corridor, which was accessible through the lower storage level, which connected to the subarchives through a door that most people did not know existed because it was behind a shelving unit that had not been moved in 12 years. She had moved it. Once, 14 months ago, when she had needed to transport an unusually large box of documents without using the main corridor. She had moved the shelving unit, found the door, oiled its hinges because they were corroded, and moved the unit back. She had not thought about it since in any deliberate way. It had simply become part of her mental map of the building. She packed 1 bag. Everything that mattered fit in it because the things that mattered were the copies she had made. The real ones, not the folders she had given Kaylin, which contained accurate duplicates. The originals were not in this building. The genuine copies were in a second location she had chosen 3 days after first removing the documents, because she had read enough correspondence in her career to understand that important things should never exist in only one place. She moved the shelving unit and went through the door. The kitchen corridor was hot and smelled of burned fat and the particular herbal steam of the evening soup service. 3 cooks and a washing boy were working at the far end. She moved along the nearer wall, behind the hanging pots, through the organized chaos of a palace kitchen that was accustomed to invisible people moving through it on various errands, and nobody looked at her. The north service entrance had a guard post. 1 man. Young. He was eating something. She could see the shape of it in his hand, and looking at the middle distance with the expression of someone who had been told to be here and had not been told why, which was the most useful expression a guard could possibly have from her perspective. She was not the delivery she was waiting for. She chose not to go through the entrance at all. The post was positioned to observe the door. It was not positioned to observe the drainage alcove beside the door, which was architectural, 3 feet deep and 2 feet wide, designed to channel water away from the foundation and functionally invisible to anyone whose attention was fixed on the door it sat beside. She moved into the alcove, waited, and when the guard's attention shifted to something on his other side, a sound, a movement. It did not matter. She moved through the door in the time it takes to breathe. Outside, cold air, the service alley, the smell of the city. She walked. She did not walk toward the Eastern Market District. She walked north first, then east, then south, adding 40 minutes to a 15-minute route for no reason that anyone watching would understand, except that anyone watching would, by the third turn, have identified themselves by their continued presence. Nobody continued. She arrived at the private rooms, 1 narrow space above a second-hand cloth merchant, accessed by a stair that had creaked the same way for 4 years. At the hour when the market district was transitioning from evening commerce to late-night activity, and the ambient movement of people in the streets provided its own camouflage. She lit the lamp, unpacked the bag, set out the documents in the order she had established for herself. Original sequence, then chronological, then by correspondent, and read through them again with the methodical attention that was as close to instinct as anything she had ever developed. The architect. She had been turning this over for 3 weeks. The letters were careful, initialed, not signed, with the kind of coded reference language that people use when they want deniability, but need their correspondent to understand specific instructions. FH was identifiable by context once you knew enough about the council composition. The architect was more carefully obscured, but the letters were written in a particular style, not the style of a man dictating to a scribe. These were handwritten, personal, the sentence structures of a man who composed his own correspondence. She had read enough documents in enough different registers to develop a sense for individual written voice, the same way a person develops an ear for spoken cadence. This voice was old, not old in the sense of uneducated, educated, clearly, classically trained, with the periodic Latin construction that had gone out of fashion approximately 30 years ago in formal imperial writing, but persisted in men who had been educated before that shift. The kind of man who was at minimum in his late 50s, comfortable with authority to the degree that he did not feel the need to assert it. The letters instructed without demanding, suggested without softening. He had also, in one of the letters, referenced a campaign decision from 14 years ago. A specific campaign, a specific decision, in a way that indicated he had been present for the deliberation, not reading a report of it afterward. 14 years ago. Imperial Council campaign deliberations were attended by council members and, before the formal restructuring of advisory roles 12 years ago, by the office of the Senior Strategic Counselor. She had 3 names on the list of men who had held that office. 2 were dead. The third had retired 14 months ago. She had not known what to do with this conclusion when she first reached it, because knowing a thing and being able to use that knowledge were different problems. She still did not know what to do with it. But now she had a sealed letter from a deposed king and a street address written in handwriting that was decisive and angular and told her he had not learned his penmanship for presentation. She looked at the address on the paper for a long time. Then she opened a new sheet of paper, wrote 4 sentences, folded it, and placed it inside the book she had brought in the bag. She would send it in the morning. Through the specific street runner she had used for the past year to handle correspondence she did not want processed through palace channels. A boy named Fen, who was 12 years old, observant, and had figured out very quickly that she would pay better than his other clients if he maintained the specific quality she required, which was invisibility. She lay down on the narrow bed with the lamp still burning and stared at the ceiling. She was not, in her own honest assessment, a brave person in any conventional definition of the term. She had never gone looking for difficult situations. She had never understood people who described themselves as thriving under pressure, as though pressure were a preferred environment rather than an unfortunate condition to be minimized. What she was, and what she had always been, was someone who could not leave a discrepancy alone. It was genuinely involuntary. Something in the architecture of her attention could not pass a mismatch between what a document said and what the underlying record showed without stopping. She had been fired from her first archive position because she had flagged a discrepancy in her supervisor's expense reports, and her supervisor had been the kind of man who did not appreciate careful readers. She had been hired for the next 3 positions in progressively more significant archives because the people doing the hiring had been, in each case, the kind of people who needed someone who could not leave discrepancies alone. She had not planned to end up in the Imperial Palace sub-archives. She had not planned to remove documents from the Western campaign files. She had not planned to be lying on a narrow bed in her private rooms above a cloth merchant's shop at this hour, looking at the ceiling and thinking about the particular way the deposed king had read through her folder, not scanning, genuinely reading, with the focused absorption of a man who was not performing attention but actually giving it. She had not planned any of it. She was also, she acknowledged to herself in the privacy of the narrow room, approximately 40% as calm as she was presenting. The other 60% was doing calculations that were not especially reassuring, involving things like what people who had engineered the removal of a king would do about the person who had documentation of how they had done it. She folded her hands on her chest and breathed steadily until the 60% quieted enough that she could think past it. Think about the documents. Think about what they proved and what they didn't prove, and what she still didn't know. Think about what a deposed king who could read a complex folder in 8 minutes would do next, and whether the things he would do next were things she should try to be in front of or behind or alongside. She thought about that last question for a long time. The message arrived before dawn. Kalen had not slept. He had sat in the chair by the window through the transition from deep night to the gray pre-light that preceded sunrise, maintaining the appearance of a man in his chambers while conducting, through intermediaries he trusted, the simultaneous tracking of 6 different variables in 4 different parts of the city. Wren's report came first, through the specific knock pattern on the servant's entrance to his suite. 3 things confirmed. Elara Vance had arrived safely at her private rooms. She had taken a longer route than expected and arrived alone. The letter to the Southern garrison captain had gone out with a reliable courier before midnight. The chamber records had been accessed by Wren's man in the administrative wing. The chamber records were the problem. Kalen read Wren's written report of what his man had found, and his jaw tightened fractionally. His formal objection had been recorded. Exactly as Aldrich Sorn had claimed, it appeared in the official proceedings in clear language, formal contestation of evidence and process filed by the deposed party. The date on the record was wrong. It had been dated 2 days prior to the proceeding, which meant that in the official imperial legal record, his objection had been lodged before the proceeding occurred, which made it not a formal contestation at all, but a preemptive complaint, which had a completely different legal standing. A preemptive complaint could be dismissed as anticipatory objection. A formal contestation required formal response. This was exquisitely done. The kind of administrative manipulation that required someone who understood imperial legal procedure at a level of granular detail that was not common. It preserved the appearance of due process while eliminating its substance, and it was invisible to anyone who did not know precisely what date to check against what record. Marin, or someone Marin had directed. Kalen set the report down and looked at the lightening sky. He had expected deception. He had expected it at a general level and had been preparing contingencies accordingly. But there was a difference between expecting deception and encountering its specific texture, the particular form it takes in the hands of someone who has been thinking about this longer than you have. He needed to recalibrate. The letter from Elira Vance arrived with the dawn. Plain paper, 4 sentences in the same careful hand as the documents she had shown him, delivered by a street runner who had the specific quality of absolute unremarkability. He read it. Then he read it again. She had identified the architect, not with certainty. She was careful about the distinction, and he noted the carefulness with the same attention he had given everything else about her, but with a construction of evidence that laid out the reasoning in 4 precise sentences, ending with a name. Marin Ashbourne. He already knew, but she had reached the same conclusion through an entirely separate path. Through linguistic analysis of the correspondence, through historical cross-referencing, through a kind of attention to documentary evidence that he could not have replicated and had not known enough to look for. She had also written something in the margin of the letter, not in the same careful archival hand, but quickly, slanted, the writing of someone who added a thought at the last moment and did not want to rewrite the whole thing. 6 words. I have the originals, not copies. He sat with this for a full minute. She had told him she had copies. The originals were somewhere outside the building. He had accepted that as a security measure, which it was. What she had not told him, what she had just told him, in 6 words in a margin, was that the copies she had given him were the duplicates and the originals were in her possession. The originals. Documentary originals of evidence proving a manufactured conspiracy against the imperial crown, with handwriting that could be forensically attributed, with seal impressions that could be traced, with the kind of material specificity that copies could approximate but never replicate. She had held them back. Not deceptively. She had not technically lied. She had told him she had copies outside the building, which was accurate, but she had not volunteered the information that the originals were with her. She had held them, and now she had told him. He thought about this carefully. Either this was the moment she decided to fully commit to whatever was happening between his situation and her evidence, which meant she needed him to know the full scope of what she held, which meant she was making a choice about trust. Or it was a leverage calculation, telling him she had the originals to make herself more valuable to his plans, which would be a strategic choice that he should account for. He thought about her hands on the table in the archive, the specific quality of her stillness, the gap between performance and genuine composure. He thought about the 60% she was not showing anyone and how clearly he had been able to see it anyway, not because it was visible, but because he knew what genuinely calm people looked like from the inside. He believed it was the first one. He also did not discount the second, because holding both possibilities simultaneously was simply good information management. He wrote his response in 4 sentences and sent it back with the same runner. Then he stood, straightened his coat, and made a decision that had been forming through the entire night. He was not going to spend 4 days in this building pretending to accept a transition while Marin and Fenric Hale closed every exit behind him with the patient thoroughness of men who had been thinking about this longer. He was not going to leave for the northern estates and spend the remainder of his life as a quiet problem that occasionally needed reminding of its quietness. He was also not going to launch an open challenge to the council without evidence he could place before people who had the standing to act on it. He needed the documents. He needed the woman who had them. And he needed to be outside this building before Marin finished his morning tea and concluded that a night of silence from his nephew probably meant something he should look into. He picked up the 2 letters he had written the night before, the ones to Voss and to Marin, cooperative and gracious and completely designed to read as a man settling into acceptance, and walked to the door of his chambers. He opened it. The guard in the corridor looked up. "Please see that these are delivered," Kaelin said, handing over the letters with the calm of a man conducting ordinary business. "And inform my steward that I will need the carriage prepared. I would like to visit the northern estates in advance of the formal transition. I want to see the condition of the grounds before I commit to the arrangements." The guard blinked. This was not apparently what he had expected. "The Lord Chancellor would need to authorize—" "The Lord Chancellor's office is in this building," Kaelin said pleasantly. "I am simply asking for a carriage preparation to be arranged while I finish my morning. I expect the authorization will take several hours. That is perfectly understandable." He went back inside and closed the door. Authorization. Several hours. The letter to Marin accepting the Northern Estate offer would be in his uncle's hands within the hour. Marin would read it, feel the particular satisfaction of a man whose plan is proceeding as designed, and see the carriage request as confirmation. A man who has accepted his situation is preparing to go where he has been told to go. He would not rush the authorization. He would process it graciously, with the deliberate warmth of a man being generous in his moment of success. And in the hours between the authorization and the carriage preparation, a significant number of things were going to happen that were not about carriages. Kaelin sat in his chair and thought about terrain. The best campaigns were not won in the field. They were won in the days and hours before the armies moved, and the careful placement of pieces that meant the actual battle was, in some essential sense, already decided before the first soldier took a step. He had spent this entire night placing pieces. Dawn was breaking over the capital. Somewhere in the eastern market district, a woman with ink-stained hands was looking at the ceiling and thinking about documents and loyalty and the specific calculation of what you do when you know too much to go back to being the person who didn't know. Somewhere in the palace, his uncle was waking up, reading a gracious letter of acceptance and not yet understanding what was happening. And in the southern garrison, 80 miles away, a cavalry captain who had served under Kaelin for 15 years was reading a letter in private cipher that said, in the language they had developed together over 15 years of field correspondence, "I need you. Confirm. Stand ready. Do not move until I send word." Kaelin had 1 day, not 4. 1. Because at some point before the next sunset, someone in this building was going to pull the Western Campaign secondary files and discover that several documents had been removed, and the records of that access were going to lead to the subarchives, and the subarchives were going to lead to a name. And when that happened, everything that was currently moving quietly in his direction was going to have to move very fast instead. He picked up his coat. He had always preferred the field to the palace. He was beginning to understand why. The knock at the door was not Wren's pattern, not Davin's. It was the single knock then immediate latch of someone with authority. But this time when the door opened, it was not a council guard. It was Fenric Hale, alone, without the careful smile. He stepped inside, closed the door, and said 6 words in the flat voice of a man who had just been told something he had not expected to be told. "Marin knows about the archive woman." Kaelin looked at Fenric Hale and did not move. 6 words. Marin knows about the archive woman. The information arrived with the particular quality of a stone dropped into still water. Everything that had been arranged beneath the surface now displaced, rippling outward in patterns he could not yet fully predict. He ran the calculation in the 3 seconds before he responded. Fenric had come alone. No guards, no announcement. He had used a council member's corridor access to bypass the guard post rather than the servant entrance, which meant he had not wanted to be seen arriving here. He was not wearing the careful smile. His face had the tight, over-controlled expression of a man managing something he had not planned to manage this morning. These were not the behaviors of someone delivering a warning on behalf of Marin Ashbourne. These were the behaviors of someone who had received information he did not want and had come to the one person who might understand why it was a problem. "Sit down," Kaelin said. Fenric sat. He did it with the automatic compliance of a man who was not, in this moment, thinking about hierarchy. Kaelin remained standing. "How?" The senior archivist, Fenric's voice was flat, controlled in the way of someone who had been controlling it since before he walked through the door. He conducted a routine audit of the sub-archive access records this morning. Standard practice. Every 3 months. The timing was coincidental. A pause. Or possibly not coincidental. I do not know yet. The audit flagged her access to the Western Campaign secondary files. Her access and her removal of documents. The archive record shows the files were checked out to her personal access code 14 days before she returned them. The returned files do not match the original inventory count. So the mechanism was the archive record, not the documents themselves. Someone who knew what to look for had looked for it. The senior archivist, the man whose wife was Fenric Hale's cousin, the man Elira had specifically declined to report to, had either conducted his audit at a very convenient moment or had been directed to look. "You did not send him to look," Kaelin said. It was not a question. Fenric met his eyes. "No." "Marin did." "I believe so. I was not informed." Something moved through Fenric's expression. Not guilt. Guilt was too simple for what lived in that face. Something more complicated. The particular discomfort of a man who has been an instrument in a plan longer and more extensively than he understood at the time of his initial agreement. "I was told this morning by Marin. He informed me that the archive situation required management and that he intended to manage it through the Council Guard, sent to the Eastern Market District, to an address that Kaelin had given Elira, and that he had sent his response to this morning via a street runner who was 12 years old and completely reliable and would not, if approached correctly by someone who knew what questions to ask, be difficult to trace." Kaelin's jaw tightened. He had moved too slowly. He had spent the night being methodical, when methodical was the wrong tempo. He had let the night pass in careful preparation when the thing he should have understood earlier was that Marin had not granted him 4 days out of courtesy. He had granted 4 days because 4 days was enough time to locate every variable that needed to be controlled. "When did he tell you this?" Kaelin said. "An hour ago." Fenric looked at his hands. "I came here directly." "An hour. How many men did he send to her address?" "I do not know. I was not given that information." A pause. "I was told she would be brought in for questioning regarding the archive irregularity. That is the official framing." Official framing. The particular phrase of a man who understands that official framing is a container that holds whatever the person with authority decides to put inside it. Kaelin was already at the window. The Eastern Market District was 20 minutes on foot, 12 by horse. The Council Guard moved in pairs at minimum, 4 when the assignment was considered significant. Elira had been in her private room since last night. She was not expecting this. "Why are you here?" Kaelin said, not looking away from the window. Behind him, Fenric was quiet for long enough that the quality of the silence changed. "Because I knew about the evidence against you," Fenric said. "I reviewed the forged documents before they were presented. I participated in the council determination. I am on record as supporting the suspension." Another pause. "I did not know about the archive woman. I was not told she existed. If she has documents, you are exposed," Kaelin said. "We are both exposed," Fenric said. "If she has genuine correspondence that identifies me, FH, whatever she found, and if that correspondence reaches someone with the legal standing to act on it, the forgery is proven and the suspension is invalidated." He stopped. "Which means the conspiracy is no longer Marin's private arrangement. It becomes a matter of imperial law. Imperial law that would move backward through every participant, including Fenric Hale." This was the calculation Kaelin had been running since Fenric walked through the door. The man across from him was not here out of loyalty or remorse or some late-arriving conscience. He was here because the arithmetic of his own exposure had produced a very clear answer. The only person in this building whose interests currently aligned with finding Elira Vance before Marin's men did was the man they had just removed from the throne. Power had an extraordinary capacity to clarify people's motivations. A man who had helped construct a conspiracy against the crown would offer assistance to that crown the moment the conspiracy threatened to cost him more than it gained. This was not surprising. It was simply human nature stripped of its decorative justifications, and Kaelin had been watching human nature long enough to read it without the decorations. "What do you want?" Kaelin said. Fenric stood. He walked to stand beside Kaelin at the window, and for a moment both men looked out at the city. "I want what you want. I want her to have those documents somewhere that Marin cannot reach, and I want—" He stopped, reorganized. "I want to be on the right side of what happens next." The right side of what happens next. The language of a man who understood that something was going to happen next and had decided which direction to face before it did. "You cannot be on both sides," Kaelin said. "I know. You have been on Marin's side for however long this has been in motion. That is a record. It exists. Choosing differently this morning does not erase it." "I understand that." "Then understand this as well." Kaelin turned to look at him directly. "If you are going to be useful to me, I need complete information given now without the omissions and framings that you have been providing to everyone in this building for the past 3 years. Everything you know about the conspiracy, the financing, the council members who were active participants versus passive recipients, and specifically anything about the southern garrison that I do not already know." He held Fenric's gaze. "Everything. If I discover later that you held something back, the right side of what happens next will not have a place for you." Fenric looked at him. Something settled in his expression. A decision being made behind his eyes, the kind that produces a specific quality of stillness in a person's face when they have stopped calculating and started committing. "The southern garrison," Fenric said carefully. "What do you know about it?" "Tell me what you know." A pause. And then Fenric said something that made the floor shift under everything. "Marin sent a dispatch to the Greymere outpost 6 days ago. I do not know its contents. I know it was sent because I handled the courier authorization. The garrison captain there—" "Aldrich." "Aldrich," Fenric confirmed. "Yes. I believe the dispatch was related to contingency planning for your response to the suspension." He stopped. "Kaelin, what did you send to the Greymere outpost last night?" The weight of it landed before the sentence was finished. Kaelin had sent a letter to a garrison captain he trusted, using a private cipher, through a reliable courier, carrying a message that, in the language he and Aldrich had built together over 15 years, meant, "Confirm loyalty, stand ready, await instruction." Marin had sent a dispatch to that same garrison 6 days ago. He had moved the piece before Kaelin moved his piece. He had moved it 6 days ago, which meant he had anticipated this exact contingency, a deposed king reaching for the one military resource he trusted most, and had taken action on the assumption before the deposed king had acted. "What kind of contingency planning?" Kaelin said. Fenric's voice was very careful. "The kind that would neutralize a garrison as a potential resource." Neutralize, not destroy. Marin would not have sent soldiers against soldiers, not yet, not while the transition still needed to appear legitimate. But a garrison could be neutralized without violence. A commanding captain could be reassigned. A unit could be put on readiness restriction. Movement orders could be issued that were technically routine and specifically immobilizing. Or a captain could receive a very different set of instructions 6 days before a private cipher letter arrived from a man who, as of yesterday morning, no longer held the authority to issue instructions. "I need to know right now," Kaelin said, "whether Aldrich is still in command at Greymere." "I do not know." "Who would know?" "The Garrison Communication Office, which is in this building. In this building, in the administrative wing, behind the access points that were now staffed by Voss's household guard, who reported to a regent who had been named by Marin's arrangement and received administrative guidance from Marin's long-standing presence in every significant room in this palace." Kaelin moved away from the window. This was the moment when a different kind of man would feel the walls closing, would feel the specific compression of a situation that has been orchestrated by someone who has had more time and more access and more patience, and whose every prepared contingency has now activated simultaneously. What Kaelin felt instead was a kind of cold clarity that he had only ever found in the worst moments of the worst campaigns, When the terrain had turned and the intelligence had failed and the enemy had moved faster than expected, and the only thing left was the assessment of what was actually true right now, in this moment, with the resources that actually existed. What was actually true? Marin knew about Elira. Council guards had been sent to the Eastern Market District approximately an hour ago. The southern garrison was potentially compromised. The chamber records had been falsified. He was in a building full of people who answered to his uncle, with 4 days of legitimate residence remaining, and every exit was now either watched or had been watched since this conversation was already underway. What actually existed? Ren and 8 men. Fenric Hale, whose value was specifically his palace access and his knowledge of what Marin had put in place. The copied documents already in Kaelin's possession. The originals, which were with Elira, who was 20 minutes away by foot and possibly 10 minutes away from men who had been sent to find her. He had been approaching this as a campaign to be planned. It had already become something faster. "Can you get me out of this building without the council guard knowing?" he said. Fenric looked at him. "I have council authorization to use the administrative corridor." "That is not what I asked." A pause. "The West Service Gate. It is used for council member private transport. I have standing access. My carriage uses it regularly enough that the gate guard would not think twice." "How quickly?" 20 minutes to arrange. 20 minutes. And 20 minutes to the Eastern Market District meant 40 minutes total, which was better than the arithmetic had looked 30 seconds ago, but was still dependent on variables he could not control from inside this building. He had to move now. "Arrange the carriage," Kaelin said. "You are accompanying me." Fenric opened his mouth. "You are accompanying me," Kaelin said again, with the tone he used on soldiers who had just been given an order they were reconsidering. "Because if I leave this building and you stay in it, Marin has a conversation with you in approximately 4 hours, and your usefulness to me in terms of information becomes a resource he can read. You are more valuable to me outside this building than inside it." Fenric closed his mouth. He left. Kaelin went to the desk and wrote 2 sentences on a plain paper and pressed it under the outer sole of his boot, which was an uncomfortable solution to a temporary problem. He put on the plain wool overcoat. He picked up nothing else because there was nothing else he needed from this room. He had what he needed. He also, for the first time since yesterday morning, felt the particular weight of understanding what he was about to lose. Not the crown. The crown had already been taken. Not the palace, or the power, or the formal machinery of governance that he had been running for 19 years. The name. Kaelin Ashbourne was going to walk out of the West Service Gate in Fenric Hale's council carriage, and when he did, the version of himself that carried that name with uncontested legitimacy was going to stay inside the building he left behind. What he was going to be after that gate closed was something he did not yet have a complete word for. Not a king. Not a deposed king, which implied passivity and acceptance. Not a fugitive, which implied guilt. Something older and less defined. A man with a name that no longer opened doors, moving through a city that did not know yet that its understanding of who held power had just changed. This was, he understood, the specific transformation that his uncle had engineered, not just the removal of the crown, the removal of the institutional identity that had made him legible to the world. Without the crown, without the council, without the garrison and the guard and the formal structures of authority, he was simply a man in a wool coat with a forged record and a set of documents and a woman he had spoken to once in an archive room. The question was what a man made of that. He left the chambers without looking back. The West Service Gate took 19 minutes. Fenric's carriage was a plain council vehicle, the kind that moved through the capital frequently enough to be invisible, which was the specific utility of power when it did not feel the need to announce itself. The gate guard recognized Fenric and waved them through with the bored efficiency of a man whose job required attention and whose attention had lapsed. Outside, the city closed around them. Street noise, market vendors, the specific density of morning commerce that filled the capital's western district with sound and movement and the blissful indifference of people conducting their own affairs. "Eastern Market District," Kaelin said. Fenric gave the instruction to the driver through the carriage window. They moved through traffic in silence for approximately 4 minutes before Fenric spoke. "If she is already gone," Fenric said. The sentence had no ending. He left the space open the way a man leaves a door ajar when he is not certain he wants to enter the room. Then we determine where she would go, Kaylin said. She is not a person who panics. She is a person who has spent 4 years in a building full of powerful people developing very effective strategies for not being visible to them. If she received any warning at all, she had no warning. The audit finding was 40 minutes ago. Marin moved immediately. 40 minutes from the audit to Marin's decision to move, and another 20 minutes for Fenric to reach Kaylin, and 20 minutes in the carriage now. 80 minutes total. The men Marin had sent had an 80-minute head start. Kaylin looked out the carriage window at the streets passing. The Eastern Market District resolved around them in the particular texture of a city neighborhood that had been many things over many decades and had settled into a dense, practical livability. The streets were narrow enough that the carriage slowed significantly. The buildings were tall and close. The smell was different from the palace end of the city, bread and coal smoke, and the faint ammonia of the tannery 3 streets over. He told the driver to stop 1 block from the address. He got out alone, on foot, ignoring Fenric's expression through the carriage window. The street runner who had carried his message this morning was a boy named Fen. He did not know this at the time. He had used Ren's network for the initial contact, and Ren had sourced the runner, but the note Elira had sent back had told him. Fen, 12 years old, Eastern Market District, reliable. He found a boy fitting that general description loitering at the corner of the street adjacent to the address. Fen, he said. The boy looked at him with the particular wariness of a child who has learned very young to read adult strangers. The woman you carried messages for this morning, Kaylin said. He kept his voice low. He crouched to the boy's level, which he had learned years ago was the specific physical adjustment that communicated to children that the adult in front of them was choosing to engage rather than to command. Is she still in her rooms? Ben studied him for a moment. Whatever calculation he was running resolved. Left 20 minutes ago, Fen said. 2 men came to the street, just stood there. She saw them from the window. She left out the back. 20 minutes ago. When Marin's men arrived, she had already seen them from the window and moved. She had not waited to confirm what they wanted or whether they were actually there for her. She had looked at the street, identified 2 men who did not belong there, and left. The instinct of someone who had spent 4 years deciding who to trust with which information and when. Where? Kaylin said. Fen looked at him. She said to tell the man with the angular handwriting that she went where the discrepancy was first found. He held the boy's gaze. The angular handwriting. She had seen his handwriting on the address slip and on the response note, and had made Fen memorize a description rather than a location, which meant that if someone found Fen before the right person did, the description would mean nothing without context. Where the discrepancy was first found. He knew what she meant. He had known it the moment she said it in the archive room, that her first flagged irregularity, the garrison payroll discrepancy that had produced the report he had read 8 months ago, had originated not in the Imperial Palace archives, but in the Eastern Province offices where she had worked before. She had gone back to where she started. He paid the boy more than the going rate for a message and stood up. The Eastern Province offices were in the administrative district on the other side of the market, 25 minutes on foot, 15 by carriage. He returned to Fenric. Eastern Province Administrative Offices, he said, getting in. Fenric gave the instruction without asking why. They rode. What Kaylin was thinking about, in the specific quality of silence that exists inside a moving carriage when there is too much happening to speak and not enough certainty to plan, was the nature of what had just collapsed around him. He had built a strategy on the assumption that he had time. Not much time, but enough. 4 days of legitimate residence, a night to place pieces, a morning to move before anyone had reorganized around his intentions. He had built it on the understanding of his uncle as a patient, thorough man who had granted 4 days because 4 days served his purposes, and on the professional respect for Marin's intelligence that had been constant since childhood. What he had not built it on, what he had failed to fully account for, was the specific quality of total surveillance that comes from an opponent who has been inside your decision-making process long enough to predict it. Marin had not granted 4 days as a courtesy or a confidence. He had granted 4 days because 4 days was the period within which every predictable response from Kaylin would have resolved. The reach for military resources, the attempt to locate and secure evidence, the use of trusted intermediaries. and within which Marin's countermeasures would have already activated. He had watched Kalen his entire life. He had taught him. He knew how Kalen thought about problems. He knew which assets Kalen would move toward first and which people he would trust and which routes he would use. The 4 days had been a gift of rope, and Kalen had used it exactly as predicted. This was the particular devastation of betrayal by the person who formed you. Not that they turned against you. That was painful but comprehensible. The specific devastation was discovering that the very capacities they built in you were the tools they used to map your behavior. Every lesson Marin had ever given him had also been a study. Every campaign strategy he had ever developed in consultation with his uncle had also been a data point and a model of how Kalen Ashbourne would respond to threat. He had been fully known and fully knowing and thought himself not just the student, but the equal, and the gap between those two beliefs was exactly the size of the hole he was in now. The carriage turned onto the administrative district boulevard. Fenric said, "Marin will know you left the building within the hour." "I know. What he does next depends on what he believes you have." "He believes I have copies," Kalen said. "He does not yet know about the originals." He paused. "When he finds the private rooms empty, he will assume she took the documents with her. When he cannot locate her immediately, he will move to the second layer of control. Which is, he will announce that I have left the palace in violation of the suspension terms, which makes everything I do from this point forward an action taken by a man who is technically in contempt of the formal proceeding." Fenric was quiet. "That shifts the legal standing," Kalen continued. "A formal contestation filed by a man who has respected the proceeding is a legal instrument. A formal contestation filed by a man who fled the building is the complaint of a fugitive, and complaints filed by fugitives are resolved by their capture, not by their evidence. Unless the evidence reaches someone who cannot be reached by Marin." "Yes," Kalen said. "Unless that." The carriage stopped. He went in alone again. The Eastern Province administrative offices were a mid-sized building with the particular institutional blandness of government work. Plain stone, regular windows, a reception vestibule staffed by an older man who looked up from his correspondence with the polite wariness of someone who does not receive unannounced visitors. "I am looking for a woman who may have arrived in the past 20 minutes, Kalen said. "She would have come to the records section, dark hair, ink on her hands." The reception attendant looked at him. Kalen looked back. Something in the quality of his gaze produced the specific result it usually produced in people who were not prepared to hold it. The attendant looked away first and said, "Records section is on the second floor." He went up. She was at a desk at the back of the records room, not sitting, standing behind it as though she had been about to move when she heard the footsteps and had decided to wait and identify them first. She had a bag over her shoulder and both hands flat on the desk surface, which was the posture of a person ready to move in either direction. When she saw him, her hands came off the desk. Not relief. Exactly. Something more complicated than relief. The specific recalibration of a person who has been running scenarios and has just had one of them confirmed as the one that actually happened. "The men on the street," she said. "You know about them." "I know. How long have you been here?" 15 minutes. She moved around the desk toward him. "I left before they came to the door. I do not know if they identified where I went. They will, not immediately, but eventually." He looked at her. She had clearly dressed in a hurry, practical. Nothing that would mark her as a palace employee. Plain clothing, the bag that seemed like the one she had described last night, small and fully packed. "You said the originals are not in the building. Where?" She looked at him for exactly 1 second, the second during which she decided whether he had earned the answer, and then said, "With the woman who rents the room below mine. She does not know what she is holding. I gave her a wrapped parcel 4 days ago and told her it was correspondence I needed kept safe. She does not know you. She knows me as the woman upstairs who is quiet and pays her rent on time and brings her vegetables from the market twice a week." A pause. "I did not think it would come to this so quickly." "Neither did I," Kalen said, and the honesty of it landed between them with a weight that was not quite apology and not quite admission. He had miscalculated. He had spent the night conducting operations with the focused precision of a field commander and had not adequately accounted for the fact that the person he was outmaneuvering had spent 3 years accounting for exactly how he would respond to being outmaneuvered. He had been trained by the person he was fighting, and the training had produced a predictability he had not seen clearly enough until the moment Fenric walked through his door. The originals were in a room above a cloth merchant's shop, in the hands of a woman who thought she was holding correspondence. Elira Vance was standing in front of him in the Eastern Province Records Office, with a bag on her shoulder and both hands free, having extracted herself from a watched street without warning and navigated to a location whose significance she had communicated through a street runner using a description specific enough to be understood by the right person and meaningless to anyone else. She had not panicked. She had not waited for him to rescue her. She had moved. "We need to go back for the parcel," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. The 60% she had been managing quietly was visible to him again. Not panic, not weakness, but the particular quality of genuine steadiness that is different from performed steadiness, in the same way genuine calm is different from numbness. She was afraid, and she was thinking past the fear with the methodical attention that was apparently simply how she was built. "The woman's name is Marta. She will be at the market until mid-morning. We have perhaps 40 minutes. 40 minutes. He nodded. "Let's go." They moved together toward the door. Behind them, the records room sat in its morning quiet. Somewhere in the palace, Marin Ashbourne was finishing his morning tea and reading a gracious letter of acceptance from his deposed nephew. And in approximately 1 hour, he was going to learn that his nephew was not in the building, and the careful architecture of 4 days would collapse into something considerably faster. Kaelin and Elira came out of the building into the morning street and turned toward the Eastern Market. They had 40 minutes, and somewhere between this moment and the next 40 minutes, the carriage carrying Fenric Hale, who had remained inside it, whose value Kaelin had assessed and was still assessing and had not fully resolved, was going to make a decision about which direction to drive. Kaelin did not know which way Fenric would go. He did not know if Aldrich was still in command at Grey Mere. He did not know how long it would take Marin's men to connect the Eastern Province offices to Elira's trail. What he knew was that there were 40 minutes in which to act, and that the originals of those documents were the single most important physical object in the Empire right now, and that the woman walking beside him had hidden them in the most invisible place she could think of, which was not a vault or a strong room or a coded location, but the hands of an ordinary woman who sold cloth and bought vegetables, and asked no questions because she had been given no reason to ask them. Power, Kaelin understood in that moment, had always assumed it knew where important things were kept. It had never occurred to it to look in the hands of someone it had never bothered to notice. He walked faster. Beside him, without being told, Elira matched his pace. They had 40 minutes, and then the city would decide what kind of story this was going to be. They moved through the Eastern Market with the particular velocity of two people who understood that speed and visibility were in direct opposition and had chosen a middle pace that was neither slow enough to suggest leisure nor fast enough to produce the specific human signal of someone running from something. Kaelin had learned this in the field, not from Marin, from a scout commander named Breck, who had died at the Battle of Harrow's Ridge and who had told him once that the most dangerous soldiers were never the fastest ones. They were the ones who moved at exactly the right speed for the terrain. Beside him, Elira was doing the same thing instinctively. She walked like someone going to the market because she was going to the market. Her pace adjusted to the crowd density around them, her eyes doing the specific work of peripheral attention that people who have spent years in environments where information matters develop without formal training. He noticed this. He had been noticing things about her for the past 20 minutes in the particular way that extreme circumstances sharpen attention, not cataloging her, but registering the data she produced, which was consistent and specific, and told him things about who she was that no personnel file could have communicated. The cloth merchant's building was 2 streets from the main market square, 3 floors. The ground floor frontage was open in the morning style of the district, goods visible from the street. The merchant herself present, but not aggressively commercial. A woman in her 50s with gray-streaked hair and the broad, competent hands of someone who had been handling heavy bolts of fabric for decades. Marta. Elira went to the door. "Stay here," she said quietly, without looking back at him. He stayed. This was not a natural posture for him. He was aware of that. Standing on a street while someone else conducted the critical operation with no information about what was happening inside the building and no control over its variables, This was precisely the kind of position that a man built for command found worst. He used the time to watch the street. 3 storefronts east, a man was looking at leather goods with the specific quality of attention that was directed at the goods, but not really looking at the goods. He was in his middle 30s, plain coat, nothing remarkable. He had been in roughly the same position since Kaylin turned the corner onto this street. That was 40 seconds ago. In 40 seconds of browsing leather goods, a man with genuine interest would have moved at least twice. This man had not moved. Kaylin turned away from him very naturally in the direction of the market square and spent approximately 10 seconds examining a display of dried goods with the disengaged expression of a man who is not finding what he was looking for. In that 10 seconds, he confirmed 2 additional things: a second man near the mouth of the alley on the western end of the street, and a third positioned at the far corner who had the posture of someone maintaining a sight line. 3. Positioned to cover approaches, not to converge. They were not here for him specifically. They did not know he was here, or at minimum they had not been briefed on his departure from the palace yet, or they would have deployed differently. These were men watching a known address. They had found her private rooms and extrapolated to the building below. He had perhaps 90 seconds before Elira came back through that door. If she came out with the parcel visible, the nearest man would recognize the significance. If she came out without it, they had a problem of a different kind. He turned back to the cloth merchant's doorway. The 90 seconds passed. 100 seconds. 120. She came out without the bag on her shoulder. She was carrying a folded piece of cloth, something she had apparently purchased or picked up as cover, and the bag was gone. She walked to where he was standing with the even pace of someone who had just completed a transaction and was moving on to the next thing. She did not look at him as she fell into step beside him. "Coat pocket," she said quietly, "wrapped in the cloth. Marta thought I was returning a borrowed garment." He felt the slight pressure of the wrapped package that she had transferred into his coat pocket in the half-second of proximity as she matched his stride. He had not seen it happen. He was almost certain the man watching from the leather goods stall had not seen it happen. She was very good at this. 3 men watching the building," he said. "I counted 2 from the window upstairs. 3. 1 at the far corner. A beat. I did not see the third. Northeast corner. He is positioned for the alley approach." They turned off the main street into the narrower commercial lane that ran parallel to the market. "They do not know I am here yet. That changes when Marin is informed I left the palace." "How long?" "It has been," he calculated, "approximately 40 minutes since we left. Fenric was going to be visible for as long as he remained in the carriage. If he chose to return to the palace, Marin knows within minutes of Fenric's arrival. If he chose to continue with what we discussed..." He stopped. He still did not know which way Fenric had gone. The carriage had been parked 1 street over from the administrative offices when he and Elira left on foot. He had not looked back at it. He had not been able to afford the attention. "Who is Fenric?" Elira said. He told her in 3 sentences. She walked beside him, processing this with the specific quality of silence that was not absence of thought, but active organization of it. "He is a liability," she said. "He is also the only person besides me who was in that council proceeding and is not aligned with Marin," Kaylin said. "A liability and a resource are sometimes the same thing." "That depends on which direction the liability falls." "Yes," he said. "It does." They came out of the commercial lane onto the wider street that ran toward the western district, and Kaylin stopped. The carriage was there. Fenric's council carriage, with the plain livery and the horse he had not recognized at the West Service gate, parked against the left side of the street at the intersection ahead. The driver was in his seat. Fenric was at the carriage window, watching the direction they were coming from. He had come here. He had driven from the administrative offices to this intersection and waited. Kaylin walked toward it. He was aware that this was a decision with significant downside. If Fenric had spent the past 40 minutes reconsidering his options and had concluded that his exposure was manageable and his best move was to return to Marin with information about Kaylin's location, then the man waiting at that carriage window had just handed Marin everything. He kept walking. The alternative was to turn around, in which case he was on foot in the capital city with a wrapped parcel in his coat pocket and nowhere to go that Marin did not already have covered, and the mounted council guard would reach him before the hour was out. He reached the carriage. Fenrick's face through the window was tight. Not the controlled tightness of earlier. Something had shifted in the past 40 minutes. He looked like a man who had been sitting with a decision and found it heavier than he expected. "Get in," Fenrick said. Kalen looked at him for 1 second. Then he opened the carriage door and they got in. "Where?" Fenrick said. "North Road," Kalen said. "The junction at Coldmarsh." The carriage moved. Coldmarsh Junction was 17 miles north of the capital, close enough to reach before midday, far enough that the immediate council guard radius did not extend there without specific deployment orders. It was also, and this was the specific reason Kalen had named it, on the direct route to the Greymere garrison outpost. He needed to know if Aldrich was still in command. He needed to know before he named another move. Inside the carriage, the three of them sat in the specific silence of people who have each made significant decisions in the past hour and are not yet certain how those decisions align. Kalen put the wrapped parcel on the seat between them. Nobody touched it. "Marin knows I left the building," Kalen said to Fenrick, "either from your return to the palace or from the gate guard's report, which means we have," he considered the operational timeline, "perhaps 2 hours before a formal deployment order is issued and the road north is watched." "1 hour," Fenrick said. "He moves faster than you think." "I know how fast he moves." "You knew how fast he moved when he was managing on your behalf," Fenrick said. "It is different when the management is directed at you. He does not hesitate when the objective is clear." This was true, and Kalen acknowledged it without responding to it. "I need to know about the garrison," he said instead. "Specifically what was in the dispatch Marin sent 6 days ago." Fenrick was quiet for a moment. "I did not read it. I authorized the courier." "Then tell me what the authorization language said." "Authorization requests have a subject classification." Another pause. "Personnel reassignment review." "Personnel reassignment review," which could mean anything from routine administrative adjustment to the specific mechanism by which a commanding officer was placed on administrative hold pending review of his assignment. Not removed, not charged with anything, simply frozen. Unable to receive external deployment orders or respond to external communication until the review was resolved. If Aldrich had been placed on administrative hold 6 days ago, Kalen's letter from last night had arrived at the garrison and been received by whoever was acting in Aldrich's place. Someone Marin had either installed or knew would not respond to a private cipher from a deposed king. The letter had not confirmed loyalty. It had confirmed location. It had told Marin's people exactly where Kalen's military reach was directed. He sat with this for the length of 2 streets. The rope. He had been given rope, and he had used it exactly as designed, and now the rope was taut, and the only direction left was the one he had not planned for because he had been planning the other directions. "If the garrison is frozen," he said, "and the council issues a formal deployment order within the hour, what do you have left?" This question was addressed to both of them. He had intended it for Fenrick, but he looked at Elira when he said it because the most honest answer in this carriage was probably going to come from the person with the least to protect. She met his eyes. "The documents." "The documents are evidence," he said. "Evidence requires a recipient with standing to act on it. If I am a fugitive and Marin controls the legal apparatus, there is no recipient. There are 12 council members," she said. "Marin does not control all of them. He controls the ones who agreed to the proceeding. The others were not present," Fenrick said. 3 council members were absent from the proceeding. Illness, conflicting obligations. He paused. Court Aldman attended but did not speak. Court Aldman, the gray-haired lord who had looked at the floor, whose father Kalen had carried out of a battlefield rather than leaving him for crows. "Aldman is not a man who acts," Fenrick said. "He is a man who observes." "He is a man who has been on that council for 30 years, Kalen said, "which means he has stood in more formal proceedings than anyone else in that chamber, and he knows the specific difference between a legitimate process and a manufactured one." He looked at the floor. He looked at Fenrick. Why did he look at the floor? Fenrick was quiet. "Why?" Kalen said again, not loudly. "Because the false date on the proceeding record was his suggestion," Fenrick said, "not Marin's. Aldman proposed backdating the formal objection record as a way to—" He stopped. "He proposed it as a legal precaution. Marin accepted it." Aldman, who had looked at the floor when Kalen said his father's name, who had proposed the specific administrative maneuver that converted a formal contestation into a preemptive complaint, who had been on the council for 30 years and knew the difference between legitimate process and manufactured process because he had been a participant in the manufacturing. Kalen felt something that was not quite the betrayal he had felt with Marin. Aldman had not formed him, had not taught him, did not carry the specific weight of the uncle relationship that had made Marin's betrayal a thing that lived in the body rather than just the mind. But it had its own particular quality, the specific disillusionment of discovering that the man whose loyalty you paid for in the currency of grief and battlefield sacrifice had done the math and concluded that the payment was insufficient. Power does this to people. Not all people, but enough. It creates a particular kind of arithmetic in which every loyalty is recalculated at regular intervals against current risk, and the previous balance is treated as history rather than debt. A man who would die for his commander in the field can look at a floor when that commander is being legally dismantled, not because his feeling has changed, but because his calculation of cost has. This was the specific vulnerability of ruling through respect rather than fear. Fear is consistent. Respect is subject to revision when revision becomes cheaper than the alternative. Kalen had known this. He had been told this by Myron, among others. He had considered it a cynical view of governance and had chosen to govern anyway from a position of earned trust. He was learning now what the cynics had understood. 2 of the absent council members, he said. Names, Fenric gave them. Kalen knew one of them, Lord David Marsh, who commanded significant Eastern trade interest and had 3 times publicly aligned himself against Marin's domestic policy positions. Not a friend, not an ally. A man with interests that currently ran perpendicular to Marin's, which was the specific category of person that became useful in a moment like this one. Marsh, he said. Fenric nodded slowly. He was not approached for the conspiracy. He was excluded, deliberately. Marin considered him too unpredictable. The specific quality in a council member that an architect of conspiracies correctly identified as threatening because unpredictable men do not hold to the cost-benefit calculations that make managed betrayals sustainable. Unpredictable men occasionally act on the thing itself rather than on the calculation surrounding it. Where's Marsh now? His estate, the northern seat, above Coldmarsh. The carriage hit a rut in the road and lurched. All 3 of them moved with it in the particular graceless way of people who are not paying attention to physical comfort because there are more urgent things demanding attention. Coldmarsh, where they were headed, where, 17 miles north of the capital, Lord Davin Marsh was at his northern estate doing whatever lords did on ordinary mornings when they were not participants in a conspiracy to remove the monarch. Kalen looked at Elira. She was looking at the road ahead through the carriage window. Her jaw was set. She had one hand resting on the seat beside the wrapped parcel, not touching it, but close to it, in the posture of someone maintaining awareness of something important. He thought about what this morning had cost her. She had woken up in a private room above a cloth merchant, having spent 4 years being invisible in an institution that ground through people like grain through a millstone, having spent 3 weeks carrying knowledge that nobody had asked her to carry, and that was now the reason 2 men were watching her building and a third was positioned at the alley approach. She had not asked for any of this. She had found a discrepancy. She had done the thing her attention required her to do, which was follow the discrepancy to its source. And the source had led her to a conspiracy of such scale and duration that extracting herself from it was no longer possible. The only direction was through. That was the specific nature of the trap that knowledge builds around the people who find it. Ignorance is mobile. Knowledge is not. Once you have seen the thing, you cannot strategically unsee it, and every choice you make in its presence carries the weight of what you know. She had chosen to carry that weight, and she had carried it for 3 weeks alone, and now she was in a carriage on the North Road with a deposed king and a council member whose commitment to their shared cause was still being calculated in real time. Marsh, she said, without turning from the window. He does not know you are coming. No. He does not know any of this is happening. He knows there was a council proceeding. It is public record. He does not know about the conspiracy behind it. She turned to look at him then. He receives us at his door, and you present the documents, and he looks at them. Then what? He is one council member. Even if he agrees the evidence is significant, the mechanism for acting on it runs through the Lord Chancellor's office, which is Aldrich Sorn, who was standing at the council table when the forgeries were presented. The mechanism for calling an emergency imperial review does not run through the Lord Chancellor, Kalin said. It runs through a quorum petition. 3 council members in formal agreement can call a review that supersedes the Lord Chancellor's administrative authority. It was written into the Second Compact specifically to prevent this kind of council capture. She processed this. 3. Marsh. The 2 who were absent from the proceeding. If all 3 have not been reached by Marin, and if Marin moved quickly on the domestic apparatus, he may not have addressed the outliers yet. He did not, Fenric said. The outliers were considered low risk. They lack military access and were deemed unlikely to act without institutional backing. There it was. 3 council members who had not been brought inside the conspiracy, who had been left alone because Marin's risk assessment had classified them as unlikely to act without institutional backing. Without institutional backing, meaning without a deposed king arriving at a northern estate with documented evidence of a manufactured proceeding and a wrapped parcel in his coat, containing the original correspondence of an architect who had used a council proceeding as a legal instrument for a private seizure of imperial authority. The road north was clear ahead. The capital was receding behind them in the particular way that cities recede, gradually, and then with a finality that is only apparent when you look back and realize the skyline has dropped below the horizon line. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him worth looking at. Everything that mattered was in front of him. 17 miles north, a manor house, a lord who was unpredictable, and the narrow window between now and the moment Marin deployed riders on the north road. The carriage moved fast on the open road. The horses were council stock, well-maintained, and the driver had been told to make time. Kalin held the parcel in his coat pocket with one hand, feeling the wrapped paper and the specific density of the documents inside it, the particular weight of things that should not exist but do, and therefore change the nature of every space they occupy. He thought about what Marin had said in the palace corridor. "You are a war king." This was meant as a limitation, as the specific diagnosis of a man who believed he understood what Kalin was and had built his strategy accordingly. What Marin had not accounted for, what the 3 years of patient architectural planning had not modeled, was the difference between a war king operating within institutions and a war king with nothing left to protect except the truth. This was the specific transformation that desperate circumstances produce in people built for extremity. Strip away the offices and the armies and the titles and the formal authority, and what remains is either nothing worth fearing or something worth fearing more than the version with armies. Because a man with armies moves predictably. He has supply lines to protect and political relationships to maintain, and 1,000 variables that constrain his options. A man with nothing but a coat and a parcel and a name that no longer opens doors is constrained by none of those things. He moves differently. He makes different calculations. He goes places that the version of himself with armies would never have gone, and meets with people that version would never have needed, and discovers that the terrain at the edges of power is different from the terrain at its center, rougher, more honest, and full of people who had long since stopped calculating their loyalty against institutional backing. Marsh's estate came into view at the 11-mile marker. A substantial northern manor church, stone-built, older than the Capitol building's most recent architecture, with the self-sufficient look of a place that had been managing its own affairs for generations without waiting for anyone in the Capitol to tell it how. "One problem," Fenric said. Kalin looked at him. "Marsh does not trust me." Fenric's voice was flat. "I have opposed his trade positions twice in formal council. He knows I was aligned with the Hale House interests, which run against his in the eastern markets. If he sees me arrive with you—" "I know," Kalin said. "He will not—" "I know," Kalin said again. "You will stay with the carriage." Fenric went quiet. This was the calculation Kalin had been running since Fenric named Marsh. A council member who distrusted Fenric Hale and who received them from a carriage bearing council livery had every reason to treat the entire enterprise as a council operation. A trap, a test, something designed by the same apparatus that had managed the suspension proceeding. The carriage was a liability. Fenric and the carriage was a larger liability. But the carriage had gotten them here. And Fenric, whatever his internal arithmetic, had driven to that intersection and waited, which was a choice that had kept this viable. He was still working out what that choice meant. The carriage stopped at the manor gate. Kalen got out. He walked to the gate alone. The gatekeeper, a weathered man in his 60s, who had the look of someone who had been managing this gate for decades and had opinions about who came through it, looked at him with the careful assessment of a man whose employer's privacy was his professional obligation. Kalen Ashbourne, Kalen said. He used his name fully, without title, because there was no title to use now that was not contested, and contested titles in someone else's gate were worse than no title. I need 5 minutes with Lord Marsh. What I am carrying will explain why. The gatekeeper looked at him, looked at the carriage behind him. Wait here, he said, and went inside. Kalen stood at the gate in the late morning sun with the north road behind him and the manor house ahead and the wrapped parcel in his coat pocket and the full weight of the past 18 hours in his body. The tension that had been building since the council chamber and had not released because there had been no moment in which release was appropriate and would not be appropriate until this was over or until it was not. A man learns things about himself in the hours when everything he built has collapsed. Not the useful kind of self-knowledge that comes from success and can be applied going forward. The other kind, the inventory you conduct when the building is gone, and what remains is simply you, standing in whatever is left. He had been a king for 19 years. He had never in those 19 years stood at someone else's gate and given his name without a title. He had not realized until this moment how much weight the title had been carrying that he had believed was his own. The gate opened. A man in his mid-50s came down the path from the manor house with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who has decided to assess the situation personally rather than delegating it. Lord David Marsh was shorter than his reputation suggested, compact, sharp-eyed, with the weathered quality of someone who spent time outside rather than in chambers. He wore no formal garments. He looked like a man who had been interrupted from working on something. He stopped 6 feet from Kalen and looked at him with the specific expression of a man who does not know what to make of what he is seeing. "You're not supposed to be here," Marsh said. "You are supposed to be in the palace." "I left," Kalen said. "I can see that." Marsh's eyes moved to the carriage behind the gate. "Council livery. Fenric Hale. He is not here as counsel. He is here because his interests currently align with mine in specific ways." Kalen reached into his coat pocket and withdrew the wrapped parcel. "I need you to look at these documents. I need you to look at them now, today, before the end of the morning. And I need you to understand that what I am about to ask you to do is within your legal authority under the Second Compact and carries significant personal risk." Marsh looked at the parcel, at Kalen, at the carriage, back at Kalen. "Come inside," he said. They went inside. The documents took Marsh 40 minutes to read, not because he was slow, because he was thorough, reading in the specific way of a man who had been on a council long enough to know that what a document says and what it means are different problems, and that the gap between them is where the real information lives. He read everything twice. He asked 2 clarifying questions, both about specific dates. He spent an unusually long time with the letters, the ones initialed FH, and addressed to the architect. And when he set them down, his face had the particular quality of a man who has just confirmed something he suspected without allowing himself to fully form the suspicion until the evidence was in front of him. "Marin," he said. "Yes." "I suspected something," Marsh said. "Not this specifically, but something." He sat back in his chair. "He was too quiet when the Western campaign failed. He has been too quiet all year. A man in his position with his access to the council does not become quiet unless he is doing something that requires the absence of noise. "I need 3 signatures," Kalen said. "An emergency quorum petition. It convenes a formal imperial review that supersedes the Lord Chancellor's administrative authority and requires the evidence to be reviewed by an independent panel. You need 3 council members who are not participants in the conspiracy. I need 3 who will sign today." Marsh looked at him. "The other 2 are aldermen and—" "Not aldermen," Kalen said. A beat. Marsh absorbed this. His jaw moved slightly. "Then I need the names of the absent 2. Kalen gave them. Marsh stood and went to his writing desk. He wrote 2 letters. He handed them to his household attendant and said something quiet that Kalen could not fully hear, and the attendant left at a pace that indicated urgency had been communicated. Then Marsh turned back to him. The riders will reach them within the hour. If they agree, they will agree. You do not know that. I know that Marin did not bring them inside the conspiracy because he judged them unlikely to act without institutional backing. Kaelin met Marsh's eyes. We are providing the institutional backing. Marsh held his gaze. Then something shifted in his expression. Not the controlled political face he had been wearing since Kaelin walked through his gate, but something older and less managed. You know what happens if this succeeds. The suspension is invalidated, the proceeding is invalidated. Marin is subject to formal charges. And if it fails, then the council formalizes the suspension before the review can convene, and Marin has 3 council members to add to his management problem. And I am outside the city with documents that cannot be entered into any formal proceeding. Kaelin paused. It does not fail. Marsh looked at him for a long moment. You sound like a man who has stopped calculating odds, Marsh said. I have stopped calculating odds, Kaelin said. I'm operating on objectives now. This was true. The shift had happened somewhere on the North Road, and the specific way shifts happen when a man has run out of the resources that support strategic patience and discovers that what remains is not nothing but something different. A clarity that comes from having no more moves to protect, no more institutional identity to leverage, no more carefully maintained positions to defend. He had nothing. He had documents. He had the name of a woman who noticed things. He had a council member with sharp eyes who was currently sending riders. And somewhere on the road behind them, within the hour, Marin Ashbourne would learn that his nephew was not accepting a transition. He would deploy riders. He would issue orders. He would use every instrument of institutional authority that he had spent 3 years quietly assuming in preparation for exactly this eventuality. He would move fast. Fenric had said so, and Fenric had been right about the things that mattered. Kaelin looked out the window of Marsh's manor house at the North Road and saw, at the edge of the tree line 2 miles south, the dust signature of horses moving at speed. Not one horse. 5. Moving fast from the direction of the capital, and the angle of their approach was not the road from the capital to Cold Marsh Junction. It was the road from the capital to this specific manor house. Kaelin stood. How long for your riders to reach the other 2 council members? He said, his voice flat. Marsh came to the window. He looked at the dust. An hour, he said. If they ride hard. 5 horses at speed 2 miles south, moving toward a manor house where a deposed king and 1 council member had just set the documents of a conspiracy on the table and sent riders for 2 more signatures. 1 hour. And perhaps 15 minutes before those 5 horses arrived. We need to hold this house, Kaelin said. He looked around the room. The desk. The documents on the table. The window facing south. The door. Marsh was looking at him with the expression of a man who has just fully understood what he agreed to when he invited someone inside his gate, and from somewhere outside, in the direction of the carriage, came the sound of Fenric's voice. Sharp, raised, not controlled, followed by silence. The kind of silence that comes after a voice is cut off. Kaelin moved to the door. He opened it. In the manor courtyard, Fenric was standing against the carriage with his hands raised, and his face the color of chalk. And in front of him were 2 men who had arrived at the gate from a direction that was not the south road. From the west, from the tree line, with the specific posture of men who had been positioned to wait, and had been waiting since before Kaelin arrived. Not 5 horses. 5 plus 2. Marin had not followed him. Marin had predicted him. Standing in the manor doorway with the documents on the table behind him, and Marsh at his shoulder, and the wrapped originals in his coat pocket, and the South Road dust signature, still 2 miles out in closing, Kaelin understood with the cold finality of a man reading terrain at the last possible moment that he had been right about one thing and wrong about one thing. He had been right that Marin moved fast when the objective was clear. He had been wrong about when Marin had been told he left the palace. He had not been told an hour ago. He had been told immediately, which meant the 4 days had never been 4 days. The 4 days had been exactly as long as it took for Kaelin to move and for Marin to watch him move and position accordingly. And the North Road and the Cold Marsh Junction and Lord Davin Marsh's estate had been destinations Marin had considered and prepositioned for, because Marin had taught Kaelin what to do when his military resources were cut off and his institutional standing was gone, and he needed one unpredictable council member who could not be managed through the normal apparatus. The student had been completely legible. The two men in the courtyard looked past Fenric at Kaelin in the doorway. One of them said, "You need to come with us." And Kaelin looked at the South Road dust, and at Fenric's chalk-white face, and at the documents on the table inside, and at the wrapped parcel in his coat pocket, and felt the specific weight of a man who has one move left and does not yet know if it is enough. He looked back at Marsh. Marsh looked at him. "The riders," Kaelin said. "Did they leave?" 3 minutes before you came inside," Marsh said quietly. 3 minutes. 57 minutes remaining. Kaelin turned back to face the courtyard. Kaelin stepped into the courtyard, not because he was complying, because the door was the wrong place to make this decision, and he understood instinctively that a man who lets his circumstances choose his terrain has already lost half the engagement before it begins. He stepped into the courtyard and let the morning light fall on him directly, and looked at the two men who had come from the western tree line with the steady, unhurried attention of someone who is taking inventory. They were good. Not palace guard. Palace guard had a specific quality of institutional confidence that came from operating inside a structure that backed them. These men had the different quality of men who had been deployed quietly, positioned in advance and told to wait. Professional, patient. The kind of men Marin would have sourced through private channels rather than formal council deployment, which meant their presence here was not on any official record. That was information. The documents, the nearer man said. He was the one who had spoken before. Mid-40s, the flat voice of someone accustomed to giving instructions to people who did not have the option of refusing. And the woman. Kaelin said nothing. Behind him, in the doorway, he could feel Marsh's presence. The Lord had not retreated into the house. That was also information. A man who steps backward when armed men appear in his courtyard is a man who has calculated that the situation is beyond him. Marsh had not stepped backward. "The documents," the man said again. "And then this is over." Kaelin looked at him. There is a particular kind of man who believes that the completion of an instruction makes a thing finished, who cannot see past the task to the context surrounding it, who has been told what to obtain and has not been asked to understand why. This was that man. His partner, positioned to the left near the carriage, was watching Fenric and watching Kaelin simultaneously with the divided attention of someone managing two variables and not entirely comfortable with the geometry. Divided attention was a gap. "You were positioned before I arrived," Kaelin said. "From the western tree line." The man said nothing. "You were positioned before I arrived," Kaelin said again, not as a question this time, but as an observation made aloud for the purpose of everyone in the courtyard hearing it, "which means you did not follow me from the capital. You were sent ahead." He paused. "Before I left the building." The man's expression did not change, but something shifted in his posture. The specific micro-adjustment of a person who has been made to understand that the person they are instructing is not processing the situation the way they were told to expect. Marin had sent these men before Kaelin left the palace, before the council guard was posted at Elira's building, before Fenric arrived at Kaelin's door, before any of the morning's events had produced the information that Cold Marsh was a destination. He had sent them to Marsh's estate specifically, which meant he had looked at his own model of Kaelin's decision-making and produced a list of moves and pre-positioned responses before Kaelin made them. Marsh's estate had been on that list. Kaelin had come here and confirmed the prediction. He stood in the courtyard and felt the weight of being known this completely, and felt something else alongside it, something he had not expected and could not immediately name. Not defeat, not the collapse of strategy, something quieter and stranger than either. The recognition that a man who could predict him this precisely had also, in doing so, revealed the exact shape of how he thought, had mapped it with enough granularity to pre-position men at 6 possible destinations, had spent 3 years building that map, and had still needed forgeries, had still needed to manufacture evidence, had still needed 12 men in a semicircle of chairs to agree in advance, and Fenric Hale to carry the presentation and the Lord Chancellor to manage the records. Had needed 3 years of patient architecture and the full apparatus of an institutional conspiracy. If the model was complete, if Marin truly knew how Kaelin moved and thought and responded, none of that should have been necessary. A man who completely understands his opponent does not need to manufacture the conditions of his defeat. He finds the genuine conditions and uses them. The forgeries existed because there were no genuine conditions. The conspiracy existed because Marin could not achieve through legitimate means what he had convinced himself was necessary. He had been predicted. He had not been beatable through honest engagement. And there was a difference between those two things that mattered more than anything else in this courtyard right now. "The documents," the man said for the third time. Illyra came through the manor house door. Not from behind Kaelin, from the side entrance, the servants' door that opened into the courtyard from the east wing, which she had clearly identified and moved through in the time since the two men appeared. She was carrying nothing visible. Her hands were empty, and she was walking with the specific pace of someone who has calculated a route and is executing it without hesitation. And the direction she was walking was not toward Kaelin or toward the gate or toward the men. She was walking toward Fenric. The man near the carriage shifted his attention fully to her, which meant his attention was no longer divided, which meant Fenric was no longer covered. Kaelin moved, not toward the men, toward the gate. 3 steps, and he had his hand on the gate latch, and he pulled it open, and through the gate came the gatekeeper, the weathered man in his 60s who had assessed Kaelin with professional skepticism when he arrived. And behind the gatekeeper came 4 of Marsh's household staff, summoned by some instruction Kaelin had not seen given, moving with the purpose of people who have been told that something in the courtyard requires numbers. Numbers, not armed. Estate staff with the various tools of their work, and the specific quality of men who are on their own property and have been told by their employer's household that something needs addressing. Not soldiers, but bodies. And bodies in a space change the geometry of what is possible for 2 men trying to control it. The man near Kaelin reassessed the courtyard. He reassessed it fast, with the professional speed of someone who has done exactly this calculation before, and his conclusion was visible in the specific stillness that preceded a decision about whether to escalate. He decided not to escalate. This was not cowardice. It was the calculation of a man who understood that private deployment carried its own constraints, that the men who had sent him needed the situation to remain manageable, and manageable meant contained, and contained meant no bodies in a cold marsh estate courtyard that would require explanation through channels that could not be kept private. "This does not end here," the man said. "No," Kaelin agreed. "It does not." The 2 men left through the western gate, the direction they had come from, the tree line, the horses presumably waiting in the cover of it. Fenric sagged against the carriage with the exhale of someone who had been holding his breath for several minutes. Illyra stopped in the center of the courtyard. Kaelin looked at her. She looked at him. "The servants' door," he said. "It was visible from the window where I was standing," she said. "When the man near the carriage shifted to watch me, his angle on Fenric changed." "I know. That is why I moved when you moved." She nodded once. The kind of nod that is not agreement with a statement, but acknowledgement of a shared understanding. The particular communication of 2 people who have been operating in the same dangerous context long enough that some of the explanations have become unnecessary. Marsh was standing in the doorway. "They will send more," Marsh said. "Yes," Kaelin said. "How long for your riders?" Marsh looked at the sun's position. 40 minutes. Perhaps less if the roads are clear. 40 minutes. And 2 men in a western tree line with horses who would reach the capital in 30, which meant Marin knew the estate had not been secured in the time available, which meant his next move was not the same men again. It was something larger, something that had already been prepared for the contingency in which the quiet approach failed. Kaelin went back inside. The documents were still on Marsh's table, where they had been left. He gathered them with the specific care of a man handling things that cannot be replaced. He checked the wrapped originals in his coat pocket. He stood at the table and thought about what the next 40 minutes required. "Marsh," he said, "your household. How many people in this building know what was discussed here?" "Myself and my senior steward. The steward is 40 years in this house. He is not a risk." "Anyone else who saw the documents?" "No one," Kaelin nodded. "When the riders bring the 2 council members, assuming they agree to come, I need a room where the petition can be witnessed and sealed, formally, with your household seal as location record." "My study. And I need the riders to carry a second letter with them when they return." He looked at Marsh. "Not to the council members, to the Garrison Communication Office, specifically to the duty officer for the Southern Garrison District." Marsh raised an eyebrow. "The letter requests a status confirmation on the command status at Greymere Outpost," Kaelin said. Standard administrative language. It goes through your household, which has legitimate, noble communication access, and it does not reference me. A beat. Marsh understood. If Aldrich is still in command, he will receive the confirmation that his administrative hold has been triggered by a third party rather than standard protocol, and he will know what that means in the cipher we developed. Kalen paused. If Aldrich is not in command, I need to know who is, and I need that information before the petition is signed. Marsh went to his desk. He wrote. He was fast, with the practiced hand of a man who generated significant correspondence and had long since stopped laboring over it. He handed Kalen the letter. Kalen read it, added 3 words in the margin, specific words, in the shorthand that only one other person would understand. Handed it back. Marsh attached his seal and gave it to his steward, who departed at speed, and then there was nothing to do but wait. Kalen had spent his life in motion, campaigns, council chambers, the relentless forward pressure of a man who governed an empire through the specific energy of continuous engagement. Waiting had always been the hardest part, not because he was impatient, but because waiting produced the space in which all the things he had not stopped to feel caught up with him. He sat in Marsh's study and let them catch up. 19 years of a crown that had not been what he believed it was. A man who had taught him everything and had been, throughout the teaching, compiling a different kind of knowledge that served a different purpose. The specific silence of the council chamber when he had said the forgeries were fabricated, 12 faces arranged in expressions of careful neutrality, and the one face that had looked at the floor, and what each of those faces had already decided before he walked through the door. He thought about his father, about the morning the crown had been placed on his head in the throne room, the specific weight of it, the way his father had looked at him afterward with an expression he had interpreted at the time as pride, and was only now, 19 years later, reconsidering. His father had known Marin for decades before Kalen was born, had trusted him completely, had died before any of this was possible. He was grateful his father was dead. That thought arrived with the particular cold clarity of genuine sentiment rather than performed emotion, and he held it for a moment before letting it go. Elira came into the study and sat down across from him without asking. She had a cup of something, tea or water, he could not tell, that someone in the household had given her, and she wrapped both hands around it the way people do when they need something physical to hold. They sat in silence for a while. It was not uncomfortable. He had not expected it to be comfortable, but it was not uncomfortable, which was its own kind of information about the specific quality of the person sitting across from him. Most people could not sit in this kind of silence without filling it, not because they were talkative, but because silence in extreme circumstances had a weight that most people needed to move against. She sat with the weight. "The 2 men," she said finally. "They will tell Marin that the documents are still here." "Yes." "He will know the petition is being attempted." "Yes." She looked at her hands around the cup. "How fast can he move to stop it?" "Faster than we want and slower than he needs," Kalen said. "The quorum petition under the Second Compact has a specific provision. Once 3 signatures are witnessed and sealed by a noble household, the petition is legally active. It cannot be suppressed by the Lord Chancellor or by council majority. It requires a formal imperial review panel, which Marin does not control, because the review panel is drawn from the senior judiciary, not the council. And the judiciary has 3 members who served under my father and 2 who were appointed during my own reign based on legal qualification rather than political alignment." He paused. "Marin's access to the judiciary is limited. He built his apparatus through the council and the administrative channels because those were the pressure points available to him. He did not need the judiciary until now." "Until now," she repeated. "If the petition is sealed before he can physically prevent it or legally challenge its validity, the review is mandatory. The documents enter formal evidence, the forensic examination of the correspondence originals." He stopped, because the next part of what he was about to say depended on information he did not yet have, and stating it as certainty before he had that information was the specific intellectual habit he most distrusted in other people. He would not do it in himself. Elira set down the cup. "You are not certain it works." "I am certain it is the only move available that does not require military force or political capitulation," he said. Whether it works depends on variables I cannot fully control. The two council members agreeing to come. Aldrich's status. How quickly Marin deploys his next response. He met her eyes. And whether the judiciary, when presented with the evidence, does what the law requires. Versus what power requires. Yes, she was quiet. You have spent 4 years in a building watching what power requires, he said. What is your assessment? She thought about it seriously. He noted that she took the question seriously, did not deflect or qualify or offer a comfortable answer. She thought about it with the specific attention she brought to documents, looking at the actual question rather than its surface. I think power rarely does what law requires, she said. I think people inside power structures make calculations, and the law is one factor in those calculations, and usually not the largest one. She paused. But I think the judiciary is different from the council. Not because they are better people, because their position depends on the appearance of independence in a way that council members' positions do not. If the judiciary suppresses a legally valid petition in clear evidence of a manufactured proceeding, the appearance collapses. And the appearance is the thing they have instead of armies. He looked at her. You have been thinking about governance, he said. I have been reading governance documents for 4 years, she said. It is difficult to avoid developing opinions. The faint warmth that entered his chest at this was not surprise. He had felt versions of it in the archive room and in the carriage and in the courtyard. The specific quality of recognizing in someone else the same fundamental mode of engagement with the world. The attention to the thing itself rather than the performance of the thing. It was rare enough that when he encountered it, he noticed it. And noticing it now had a different quality because the circumstances had stripped away every context in which the noticing might have been complicated by power differential. He was not a king. She was not a palace servant. They were two people in a manor house north of the capital with 40 minutes remaining and a wrapped parcel between them. If this fails, he said, if the petition does not convene a review, or the review is suppressed, or Marin moves faster than the legal mechanism, then we are outside the city with documents that cannot be formally entered into evidence, she said, completing it. Yes, I have been doing that calculation. You should have left when I told you to go to your private rooms, he said. Yesterday morning, you should have taken the documents and left the city entirely and found somewhere that Marin's reach did not extend. She looked at him steadily. That was not an option. Why? Because I am not capable of knowing what I know and choosing not to do anything about it, she said. I tried for 3 weeks. It does not work. A pause. You are not the only person in this situation who had no practical alternative to forward. He held her gaze. There was a great deal in what she had just said that deserved more than he could give it in this room at this moment. And he understood that, and he believed she understood it too. And the understanding itself was a kind of communication. No, he said. You are right. You are not. The riders came back in 38 minutes. Not just riders. Lord Cassenwire arrived on horseback personally, which told Kaelin everything about how the message had been received. A man who sends a letter in response to a summons has calculated the risk. A man who gets on a horse and rides is not calculating. Lord Bren Sola arrived 12 minutes behind Wire, by carriage, which was slower but had its own significance. He had taken the time to bring his household seal and his formal council documentation, which was the preparation of a man who intended to sign something today. Both men came inside. Both men read the documents. Cassenwire finished first. He was younger than Marsh, mid-40s, with the aggressive, precise energy of a man who made decisions fast. He set the papers down and looked at Kaelin and said one sentence. Tell me this is complete. Every document I have is on that table, Kaelin said, and the originals match the copies. I can demonstrate the correspondence of specific physical markings that cannot be replicated. Wire looked at the originals. He turned one of the letters over and examined the back. He looked at the seal impression. He looked at it for approximately 20 seconds, with the focused attention of a man who knew what genuine documents looked like because he generated hundreds of them. He picked up the pen Marsh had left on the table. He signed. Sola took longer with the documents. He was a methodical reader, older, with the careful deliberation of someone who had been on the council long enough to know that speed and correctness were not the same thing. He spent 40 minutes with the papers while Wire and Marsh stood in separate corners of the room, with the contained energy of men who were waiting for something they could not accelerate. Kalen waited. He had been good at this today. He was not certain when that had changed, but it had. Sola signed. Marsh already had. 3 signatures, 1 noble household seal for location record. The petition was active. Marsh's steward, who had been waiting outside the study door, was called in. He was given the petition document with precise instructions about its delivery, direct to the senior judiciary office, by Marsh's household writer, with a formal noble correspondence seal that required acknowledgement of receipt. A document that required acknowledgement of receipt created an official record of the moment of delivery, which meant suppression after that point required overriding an official record, which was a significantly more complex operation than simply intercepting a letter. The steward left. The 4 men stood in Marsh's study, and the room had the specific quality of a space where something significant has just happened, and nobody is quite certain yet what it means. "How long before Marin is informed?" Wire said. "He may already know we are all here," Kalen said. "The 2 men in the courtyard. They had horses in the tree line. They have had enough time to reach the capital by now." "Then why has he not sent a larger force?" "Because a larger force sent to a noble estate to physically prevent 3 council members from signing a legal document is not a manageable situation," Kalen said. "He can manage this through institutional channels. He cannot manage it easily through force at this scale without creating the exact kind of visible overreach that makes the judicial review inevitable regardless of the petition." This was the specific bind that institutional power created for itself when it moved against institutional process. Marin had built his apparatus inside the system because outside the system there was no legitimate cover, and the inside of the system had provisions that the apparatus had not fully accounted for because the people who wrote those provisions had written them with men like Marin in mind. The second compact had been written after a council capture that was smaller in scale and had failed more quickly. The men who wrote it had understood that the relevant threat was not external invasion, but internal consolidation. Someone had been thinking carefully, a long time ago, about exactly this. Kalen thought about those men. Unknown to him by name, dead before he was born, who had sat in a room somewhere in the capital after a crisis had resolved, and had looked at each other and said, "What do we put in place so this cannot happen again?" The provisions they had written had survived for generations without ever being used. And now they were being used in a manor house north of the capital by a deposed king who had found them in an archive through the work of a woman who read everything carefully. He found himself grateful for careful readers in a way he had not previously understood how to be. All right, the message from the garrison duty office arrived 4 hours later. It was brief, encoded in the standard administrative language that Marsh's household communication used for official correspondence, with the 3 words Kalen had added in the margin functioning as a verification inside that language. Aldrich Connell was still in command at Greymere. The administrative hold had been attempted 6 days ago, exactly as the authorization language had suggested. Aldrich had contested it through the garrison's internal protocol, a provision that allowed a commanding officer to maintain active status pending review for a period not to exceed 10 days. He had invoked that provision and remained in command. He was at Greymere. He was waiting. He had been waiting since the cipher letter arrived. Kalen sat with this for a long time. 57 minutes, 40 minutes, 3 signatures, 38 minutes for the riders. The garrison status arriving now, 4 hours into what had become a waiting operation in Marsh's manor house, with all 3 council members present and the petition in transit to the judiciary. Marin had moved fast. Every instrument he reached for had functioned as designed. The forgeries, the council coordination, the administrative channels, the prepositioned men, and he had come within moments of it all working. What had not worked, what the 3 years of patient architecture had not fully modeled, was the specific behavior of people who operated outside the calculation. Elira, who had removed documents from an archive because she could not leave discrepancies alone, not because she had a plan. Aldrich, who had contested an administrative hold through a provision that existed specifically for situations where command was being undermined without cause. Fenric, who had driven to an intersection and waited because his arithmetic had produced an answer he had not expected to arrive at. None of these had been predictable from a model of institutional behavior, because they were not institutional. They were individual, specific, built from the particular history of people who had made choices across years and accumulated the kind of knowledge that produced idiosyncratic, unpredictable action in a crisis. Marin's model was accurate. His data set was incomplete. The Judicial Review Panel convened 12 days later. Not in the Capitol. The senior judiciary, upon receiving the petition and confirming its legal validity, exercised their provision for neutral venue, a town 40 miles east called Gravenport, which had the relevant infrastructure for a formal proceeding and was not inside the administrative radius of the Capitol Council apparatus. This decision was itself a message. The judiciary understood what they had received. Kalen attended with Marsh, Wire, and Sola, and with Elira, whose status as material witness had been formally confirmed in the petition documentation. Wren arrived separately, having managed the past 12 days inside the Capitol with the specific patience of a man who had been told to be visible and cooperative, and had done exactly that while maintaining a parallel set of observations about the movements of Council Guard and the disposition of Voss's household personnel. The garrison riders from Greymere arrived on the second day of the proceedings. Aldrich Connell walked into the hearing room and sat behind Kalen without being asked. He was a lean man with a weathered face and the particular posture of cavalry, straight, economical, carrying no excess in his bearing. He did not speak to Kalen before the session. He simply sat, and his presence in the room was a specific kind of statement that required no words. The proceedings took 4 days. Kalen gave testimony. He was precise, chronological, and entirely without the strategic smoothing that testimony in political proceedings often acquired. He said what he knew and how he knew it, and where the gaps were, and what he had inferred versus what he could demonstrate. The panel asked questions. He answered them. Elira testified for 6 hours. She was extraordinary, not in the performed way of someone who has prepared for significance, in the specific way of someone who was doing what she always did, which was reading the thing carefully and reporting what was there. She walked the panel through the documents with the methodical precision of 4 years of archival work, explaining the cross-referencing, the authorization code analysis, the linguistic evidence, the date discrepancies, and the chain of inference that had led her to the identification of the architect. At the end of her testimony, the panel's senior member looked at her over the top of his reading spectacles and said, "You are employed as a sub-archivist." "Yes," she said. "For how long?" 4 years in the Imperial Palace, 8 years total in various archive positions. He looked at her for a moment. "This panel thanks you for your thoroughness." She nodded without elaborating. Kalen, watching from his seat, felt something in his chest that was specific and specific only to this. Not pride, which implied ownership he did not have, but the particular quality of being present when someone's actual nature is seen clearly by people with the standing to recognize it. Marin did not attend. He sent legal representation, which was his right. The representative offered procedural objections to the petition's validity and to the evidentiary standards for the documentary evidence. The objections were heard. The panel deliberated on each one. All were overruled. On the 4th day, the panel issued its determination. The suspension proceeding was invalidated. The evidence presented in that proceeding was found to be fabricated, with the fabrication attributed to parties acting in coordination with each other for the purpose of illegally transferring imperial authority. The false dating of the formal objection record was identified as an additional act of procedural fraud. Formal charges were referred to the Imperial Court for prosecution. Marin Ashbourne's name appeared in the referral document. So did Fenric Hales, with a notation of cooperation. So did Aldrich Sorns. So did Lord Court Aldmans, whose role in proposing the record falsification had been entered into evidence by Fenric's testimony. The suspension was nullified. The Crown reverted. Kalen sat in a hearing room in Gravenport, 40 miles east of the capital, and read the panel's determination and felt the weight of it land in his body without the quality he would have expected, without triumph, without relief exactly, without the particular satisfaction of a vindicated man. What he felt was something quieter and stranger. He felt the specific recognition that the thing had worked, not because he had been the most powerful person in the room at the right moment, but because a collection of people had each made specific individual choices that Marin's model had not accounted for. A woman who could not leave discrepancies alone. A garrison captain who contested an administrative hold on principle. A council member who was unpredictable. A lord who looked at the floor and could not entirely suppress the memory of who had carried his father out of a battlefield. The crown had been returned, but it had not been returned by force or by superior strategy or by the instruments of power he had spent 19 years building. It had been returned by people who had chosen to act when acting was not their institutional obligation and was not in their obvious interest and cost them something real. That was a different kind of thing. He was going to have to think about what it meant for how he governed. He looked across the room at Elira, who was speaking quietly with the panel's recorder about the formal procedure for returning original documents to evidence archives. She was being precise about it, making sure the chain of custody was correctly recorded, doing the thing she did, which was ensuring the records were right. She looked up and met his eyes briefly. The 60% was quieter now. Not gone. He did not think it would ever be gone entirely, which was not a flaw, but a quality, the mark of someone who understood the weight of what they were carrying, but quieter. He nodded. She nodded back. The return to the capital was 3 days after the determination. The council that had conducted the original proceeding had dissolved in the interim, which was not something Kaelin had arranged, but was the natural consequence of the determination becoming public. Several members had resigned. One had been taken into formal custody pending the prosecution referral, and the remainder had the particular quality of people who were waiting to understand which way the institutional gravity was going to settle. Voss had departed quietly, not apprehended, not charged. Voss had been a managed instrument rather than an architect, and the determination had treated him accordingly. He was not in the capital when Kaelin returned to it. The palace felt different. This was a thing Kaelin had not expected and could not entirely account for. The building was the same. The marble, the corridors, the banners with the iron hawk, which had been rehung in proper condition by someone in the past 12 days. The throne room. He stood in the throne room alone for approximately 10 minutes on the first evening, not sitting on the throne, standing in the center of the room the way he had stood 12 days ago, but with the understanding he had now about what that room contained and what it did not. It was a room, an important room with significant symbolic weight and practical function, but it had not protected him. The institutional authority it represented had not protected him. The formal title had not been worth anything on the day 12 men in a semicircle decided what it would be worth. What had protected him, what had actually moved through the past 12 days and produced the outcome, was smaller and specific and not located in this room at all. He spent the first 2 weeks back in the capital working with the 3 council members who had signed the petition on the structure of the rebuilt council, not rebuilding it as it had been. Marsh and Wire and Sola had opinions about what the old structure had enabled, and those opinions were specific and grounded in 12 days of thinking about what had nearly happened. Kaelin listened to them. This was different from before. Before, he had consulted advisors and received their input and made decisions in a process that was fundamentally his. Now he listened differently, with the attention of someone who understood that his own blind spots had been precisely mapped by the person he trusted most, and that the correction for that was not to find someone else to trust completely, but to build processes in which multiple people's vision covered the blind spots of any single perspective. Marin had been brilliant at seeing how Kaelin thought. He had been wrong about what Kaelin would do when genuinely cornered. What Kaelin had done when genuinely cornered was find the people Marin had not modeled and rely on them. The correction, therefore, was not to become unpredictable. He could not manufacture that quality. The correction was to build structures that naturally included people Marin's type did not think to account for. People in the sub-archives, people who noticed discrepancies, people who contested administrative holds on principle, people who were, by the usual calculations of institutional power, entirely insignificant. He brought this thinking to the council restructuring directly. Marsh thought it was radical. Wire thought it was practical. Sola said he needed more time to consider it. Kaelin gave him the time. Bob, he asked Elira to stay on in the palace in a formally defined role 6 weeks after the return. Not in the sub-archives. In the intelligence office, a position that had existed informally under several previous arrangements and had never been given proper institutional standing because nobody had wanted to formalize the admission that the crown needed someone whose specific function was to notice what everyone else missed. He gave the position a formal title, a formal record, a formal seat in the intelligence briefings. He asked her in Marcia's study, actually, during one of the council working sessions, which made it not exactly a private conversation and not exactly a formal one. She was there because Wire had wanted her analysis of several documents related to the prosecution referrals, and she had provided it with the same precise attention she brought to everything. After the session ended and the room cleared, he asked. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at him for a moment. "The intelligence office," she said, "with formal standing, access to briefings, a defined mandate." "Which is?" "To read things carefully and tell me what is actually there." She was quiet for approximately one breath. "That is the entire mandate." "That is the entire mandate," he said. "I have spent 19 years surrounded by people who told me what they believed I wanted to understand about what was there. I have some interest in replacing that with someone who will tell me what is actually there." She held his gaze. "I should tell you," she said, "that I will not adjust my findings based on what the findings are politically inconvenient for." "I know. I told you about Marin before I knew whether telling you was safe for me to do," she said. "I will do that with anything I find, including things about the Crown's own operations." "I know," he said again. "You have known people for 19 years, she said, "and the most significant threat to your governance came from the person you had known longest and trusted most. I am not sure that familiarity is the asset you are treating it as." He looked at her steadily. "You are right. It is not. What I am treating as an asset is your particular quality of attention, which is not dependent on familiarity, and is not something I can manufacture through institutional design." He paused. "I'm asking you to stay because you are the most genuinely useful person I have encountered in a long time. That is the entire reason." She considered this with the specific seriousness she brought to consequential questions. "All right," she said, "not enthusiastically, not performatively. The way someone agrees to a thing when they have thought about it honestly and arrived at yes as the accurate answer." He accepted the yes the same way. He was learning that things received plainly tended to be more durable than things received with ceremony. Shit. The formal judicial proceedings against Marin took 8 months. Kalen did not attend them. He followed the records, which Elira organized and summarized with the same precision she brought to everything, and he read the summaries and asked questions and received answers and made no public statements about the prosecution. This was deliberate. He had thought about what Marin said in the palace corridor, that Kalen was a war king, that he reached for the instrument he knew when other instruments failed. The prosecution was running through an independent judiciary, and what it needed from him was exactly nothing. No interference, no pressure, no shaping of its direction in service of an outcome he preferred. It needed to be what it was, which was a legal process evaluating evidence according to the law. He could provide that. It turned out to be one of the harder things he had done. The proceedings concluded with findings that Kalen did not read until the evening of the day they were issued. He sat in his study, not the formal office, the private room he had reorganized after the return, the one where the maps were on the walls again, and read the findings alone. Marin Ashbourne was found culpable on every referred charge. The determination included a detailed account of the 3 years of planning, the specific individuals involved, the mechanism of the forgeries, and the administrative maneuvers that had supported the suspension proceeding. It was thorough. It was legally precise. It was, in the specific language of judicial determination, damning. Kalen read it and then set it down and sat with his hands flat on his desk and breathed in the specific way he had practiced since the corridor outside the sub-archives. In through the nose, slow, out through the mouth. His uncle had spent 3 years building the case for removing him, had used everything he knew about Kalen to do it, had been wrong about what Kalen would do when reduced to nothing, and that wrongness had been his instrument's undoing. Kalen had been wrong about his uncle for 19 years. He did not know, sitting in his study with the findings in front of him, what to do with the totality of that wrongness. His own, not Marin's. The question of what to do with the version of himself that had trusted so completely and been so precisely known and had not seen it was one that he expected to be living with for a long time. He did not think that was a problem to be solved. He thought it was a thing to be carried. He had learned this from watching Elira carry the weight of knowing things she could not unknow. You did not put it down. You adjusted your posture and kept moving and let the carrying change you in the directions it changed you. He folded the document. He stood. He walked to the window and looked out at the capital, which was doing what cities do, moving through the evening in the ordinary business of thousands of lives that did not know and did not need to know about the documents on his desk. The empire was not what it had been 12 days before the suspension. It was not what it had been during the 3 years of Marin's patient architecture. It was not what it had been at the beginning of the Western campaign or at the coronation or on the day Kaelin had first sat in the throne room alone and tried to understand the weight of what he had been given. It was what it was now, which was imperfect, and rebuilt with a different kind of intention than it had been built with before, and full of people who had made specific choices under pressure and would make other choices under other pressures and could not be predicted or fully controlled or relied upon to be consistent, which was, Kaelin had learned, not a vulnerability. It was the only thing that had ever actually worked. He stayed at the window until the capital's lights came up against the early dark, and then he went to find Elira, who was probably still in the intelligence office reading something carefully. She was. He knocked on the open door. She looked up. "The findings came back," he said. She nodded. She had known they were due today. And? Complete. A pause. She looked at him with the specific quality of attention she gave to things that mattered. Not sympathy, which would have been the wrong note, but genuine presence, the particular quality of a person who is actually in the room with you and not in their own response to the room. "Are you all right?" she said. He thought about the honest answer. "I will be," he said, "eventually." She accepted this without improvement. That was, he had found, one of the rarest qualities in a person. The willingness to receive an honest answer without trying to make it better. To let it be what it was and trust that what it was would be enough. "There is a trade dispute in the eastern provinces," she said after a moment. "The quarterly report has 3 inconsistencies in the revenue figures that I want to go through with you tomorrow morning." He looked at her. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "The eastern trade numbers have been off for 2 quarters, she said. "It is not urgent, but it should be addressed before it becomes urgent." He stood in the doorway of the intelligence office and felt something that was not happiness exactly, but lived in the same territory. The particular quality of being in a place that was right, doing things that were real, surrounded by people who were honest about what they saw. "Tomorrow morning," he said. He went back to his study. He opened the maps on the wall. He began to read. The empire was imperfect and rebuilt and full of people who could not be predicted. He had learned to find that sufficient. It was, in the end, the only honest foundation anything had ever been built on. The rest was architecture.